In the small town of Roaring Spring, Kentucky, a fire erupted in a family's home. Firefighters rushed to save those inside, battling the blaze with everything they had. But once the flames were extinguished, they uncovered something far more sinister. This is the story of the Frensley family. Now, let's get into the case for today. It's the evening of October 15th, 2008. Emergency personnel are rushing around Jenny Stewart Medical Center in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, as a patient in critical condition is about to be transported into their emergency department from the small rural community of Roaring Spring, about 16 miles away. The information known to authorities at this time was that a fire had engulfed a property where a female had been found outside in the backyard, badly injured, burned, and clinging to life. The patient was identified as 36-year-old mother of three, Kristy Frensley. Upon her arrival and subsequent medical assessment, it was determined that Christie would need to have immediate and extensive life-saving surgery, which included placing her in a medically induced coma. No one knew what had happened to Christie, and she was unable to speak. About 30 people were gathered outside the hospital. They were waiting for updates on Christie's condition, but it would be a while before they knew whether Christie would pull through. Meanwhile, police were trying to find out as much information about her as possible in an attempt to piece together the events that led to this horrific situation. Deputy Kenneth Butts, who accompanied Christie to the hospital via ambulance, was also a close friend of hers. Christie was his daughter-in-law's best friend. He had known her most of her life. He held her hand and her head the entire ride. He was able to provide information about her identity and how she was found. He was a former firefighter and the first officer on the scene. He was directed to the backyard of her residence, located at 169 Military Road in Roaring Spring, where he found Christie floating inside her above-ground pool. It was connected to a deck attached to a few stairs that led to a set of French doors to a main bedroom of her one-story home that she shared with her children. It was apparent that her wounds were life-threatening. He observed cuts to the back and front of Christie's neck. Shocked, he frantically asked, "Christie, who did this to you? Do you know them?" "Before I tell you what happened next, let me tell you who Kristy Frensley is and the life she was living before that fateful fall afternoon in 2008, when she would find herself close to death in her own backyard, and now fighting for her life in surgery." Christie was born in May of 1972 to parents Michael and Linda Glass, but she said that even though that's when life began for her, Christie's favorite 3 chapters of her life are when her 3 children were born. Becoming their mother was what she was the most proud of. She lived for her children. Christie married Doug Williams, and by May 19, 1991, they were welcoming their daughter, Kayla Elaine Williams, into the world. Christie was only 19 at the time. She was overjoyed, but it wasn't long before it became apparent that things were not going to work out between her and Doug. They divorced soon after Kayla was born, and just a few years later, by 1994, Christie was about to have her second child, another daughter that she named Courtney Lynn McBurney. Courtney's father, Roy McBurney, did not become a fixture in his daughter's life. Instead, Christie found herself as a single mother of 2 girls until she met and fell in love with Jeff Hugh Frensley VI, a U.S. Master Army Sergeant stationed at Fort Campbell Military Base located on the Kentucky-Tennessee border. Christie ended up marrying Jeff, and her daughter Courtney even took his last name. She became Courtney Lynn McBurney Frensley, and Jeff adopted her. Then, just 3 years later, on January 26, 2003, Christie and Jeff had a son together who they named Ethan Zane Frensley. Now they were a family of 5, with Kayla 12 years old, Courtney 9, and newborn Ethan to add to the mix. Life was very busy in the Frensley household. They were living in the Roaring Spring neighborhood, a rural, close-knit, safe community where everyone knew one another and never locked their doors. It was conveniently only 25 minutes away from Fort Campbell. This is what Roaring Spring looks like from a bird's-eye view, very green. The homes are on a lot of land, but they're close enough together for residents to develop a strong sense of community. You get to experience 4 distinct seasons in this part of Kentucky as well, and that means there are a variety of different activities and events every season. This brings in locals and visitors as well. The cost of living is low, and there are many beautiful areas nearby. Not to mention, many active military and veterans decide to settle down here since it's close to Fort Campbell. Roaring Spring is part of Trigg County. The main and most lively area is the city of Cadiz, which is about 25 minutes north, and that's where all the schools are, where the downtown area is, and you can find lots of restaurants, shopping, and social events taking place. Buses would transfer children to and from Roaring Spring to Cadiz on the weekdays to attend school. Kayla and Courtney, only being about 3 years apart, were very close growing up. However, after her sophomore year in high school, Kayla did decide to go live with her biological father, Doug Williams, in California for a little while. Things were good in the Frensleys' lives until they weren't. Issues were brewing between Jeff and Christie, and by the time 2007 rolled around, it would prove to be a very challenging year. They were in the middle of a heated divorce and custody battle over 4-year-old Ethan. Christie had also recently lost her job as a hairstylist. The divorce was finalized in February, and in July the court granted Christie custody of Ethan and ownership of the family home that they were living in at 169 Military Road in Roaring Spring. Jeff moved out, but then, that same month, he submitted for temporary custody of his son, citing that Christie was endangering Ethan by being intoxicated in front of the kids, keeping the house a mess, and not taking Ethan to regular doctor's appointments. The court granted the temporary switch of custody from Christie to Jeff, while these allegations were being investigated, and Ethan began living with his father and attending kindergarten in Clarksville, Tennessee. This was a tough time for everyone, but especially tough on Christie, whose world revolved around her children. Ultimately, Trigg Circuit Judge C.A. Woodall determined that Jeff's claims were unfounded. There was no evidence to support that Christie had any problems with substance abuse. She even submitted to court-ordered drug tests, which all came back negative for illicit drugs. Therefore, on October 1, 2008, the judge decided not to permanently alter the custody agreement, and Ethan went back into Christie's care after months of being separated from his mother. While all of this was going on, 17-year-old Kayla had decided to move back from California, where she'd been with her biological dad, Doug, and back in with Christie. She began to attend Trigg County High School with her 14-year-old sister, Courtney. She wanted to spend some time with that side of her family until she graduated. Then, she had plans to return to her father's out in California to go to college. It didn't take long for Christie and the kids to get back into the swing of things. Christie's oldest daughter, Kayla, was already well known in the town. She had grown up there, and now she was back. Her best friend from childhood, Danielle Riddick, couldn't have been more excited. She and Kayla had been inseparable since middle school when they were on the yearbook staff together. They even had an entire page in the yearbook filled with pictures of just the two of them. Danielle was so sad when Kayla moved away, but they talked on the phone every day, so she felt like her best friend had never really left. But now they were reunited. They enjoyed going to the movies, attending football games, and just being ordinary teenage girls. They spent many sunny days in Kayla's backyard, which everyone referred to as the beach house, because the pool area was like a little oasis. Kayla was a beautiful, studious, popular, athletic teenager. She looked a lot like her mama. She was the secretary of the senior class, part of the high school's dance team, and she was the chapter president of Family, Career, and Community Leaders of America. Taking on this role allowed Kayla to motivate and inspire her classmates. But she was like most girls her age. She just enjoyed spending time with friends, being outside in the sunlight, especially if that meant jogging around her neighborhood, playing soccer, swimming, and of course, four-wheeling, which she loved to do. What Kayla was looking forward to the most was getting her driver's license. 14-year-old freshman and middle child, Courtney, was a bit quieter than her older sister, and like many teens, she liked spending time on social media. The go-to websites at the time were MySpace and Bebo, where she had profiles that said she loved God, and she was the happiest when she was around her friends and skateboarding. She listed her favorite music as hard rock and rap, and her favorite food as chicken and dumplings. Her biggest fear was sharks. Her sunny personality and bright smile reflected her positive attitude toward life. She was always willing to help classmates and teachers, never wanting to disappoint anyone. Courtney had been interested in becoming an orthodontist since she was just a little girl, and she hoped to pursue that dream one day. Both of Christie's daughters adored their little brother, Ethan. They were always looking out for him, playing with him, and making sure he was taken care of. He was adorable, and it was hard not to love little Ethan. Everywhere he went, he was making people smile. He was just so fun and full of life. Like many little boys his age, he would talk non-stop. He loved being outside, riding his bike, and he loved animals, especially bugs. Ethan enjoyed collecting earthworms and bringing them home to his mom in Ziploc bags. Despite being new to the school, Ethan was already well known by the staff at Trigg County Primary School. He had attended preschool at Cotty's Methodist Church before beginning kindergarten back in Tennessee with his dad. But now, back in Roaring Spring, he loved to dance with his classmates, especially to the Nutcracker, and he was known throughout the school for his incredible hugs that made everyone around him feel loved and appreciated. Despite his young age, Ethan left a lasting impression on the people he interacted with. He seemed like a bit of what some people call an old soul. Contrary to what her ex-husband, Jeff, may have said in his court filings, Christie did not keep a messy house. She took pride in her home, kept the landscaping very neat, and loved spending time in her flower garden. That's where you could find her any time she had time off. Now that she was between jobs, she was spending more time tending to her garden. But there was another reason. She wanted to make the home look nice and have curb appeal. She had recently put it up for sale through a realty agency called Service First. Even though she loved the Roaring Spring area, it was time for a change. She was sick of the 20-minute commute to Trigg County anytime she needed anything. She and the kids looked forward to selling their home and moving closer to town. Now I want to jump back to October 15th. It was a normal day. Kayla, Courtney, and Ethan left on the school bus that morning. They were expected to be dropped back off by the bus at 4 p.m. like every other school day. But just 58 minutes past 4 p.m., a neighbor called 911 to report black smoke billowing out of Christie's home, which was directly across the street from the Roaring Spring Volunteer Fire Department, mere yards away. Karen Walker was one of the first residents to see the blaze after picking her son up from school. When she realized that Christie's Jeep was parked in the driveway, she knew Christie and the kids were probably inside the house. Karen stopped and began screaming, "There are babies in there!" A man named Sean Laurie, who lived on a nearby road and had been in the middle of packing for his deployment to Afghanistan, noticed the smoke and heard the commotion. When he heard someone scream, "There are kids inside the house," he jumped into action, running right into the burning house through the front door. He yelled to see if anyone was inside, but he didn't get an answer and couldn't hear anything. Then the fire began raging even bigger, making it hard to breathe because of the smoke, and the heat became too overwhelming for Sean. He couldn't keep going, so he ran back outside. It was a frantic scene as they waited for firefighters to arrive. Although the station was right across the street, it took them 9 minutes to get to Christie's house after that initial 911 call came in. But you know how this goes. Someone calls, they try to figure out what's going on, and they transfer you to another department. At 5:15, locals John Schrecker, a Hopkinsville businessman, and John McCubbin, a physician, were out for a bike ride when they saw a bunch of smoke coming from a home in Roaring Spring. Then 2 ambulances raced past them. They followed the emergency vehicles and saw the house up in flames. John Schrecker was the one who took this photo with his phone, one of the only photos I've seen of the house on fire. At that point, emergency personnel were just arriving on the scene, and a police officer was already blocking off the driveway with caution tape. We know that Christie was transported to Jenny Stewart Medical Center that evening after being spotted floating in her pool. When Christie was admitted to the hospital, she was cold to the touch and had a rapid heart rate. Yes, Christie had burns, but the other injuries were not consistent with a house fire. When being examined, doctors noticed Christie had a fractured skull, several life-threatening stab wounds to her neck, and her ear canal and vocal cords had been severed. It wasn't until an X-ray was done that doctors discovered a broken-off butter knife lodged in her neck. Dr. Francis Marshall Van Meter removed that knife during surgery and closed up what wounds he could. It was obvious that someone had tried to murder her, but who? Close friend and Deputy Kenneth Butts explained that when he saw Christie, he asked, "What happened?" She said someone forced themselves on her. She used the R word that I can't use here, but the deputy asked, "Christie, who did this?" She replied, "I don't know him." That was all the information they had, but it was enough to make sure they collected a vaginal swab as part of the investigation before she was taken away and into surgery. Miraculously, Christie survived, but it would take several hours before she was able to communicate with anyone again. As she went in and out of consciousness, she asked about her children. She was told that they were in good hands, and that what was important right now was that she got some rest. They needed Christie to pull through so they could ask her important questions that would hopefully lead to the arrest of the man who did this to her. There were so many questions, and it would be 3 days before Christie was coherent enough to understand the gravity of the situation and provide any information to the police. Christie was well known and loved in her community. Everyone was waiting for her to wake up. Her family, friends, and even local law enforcement agents who were close to Christie were praying for her recovery. Finally, Christie was awake and surrounded by familiar faces. Everyone in the room was happy that Christie had made it out alive. This poor woman had already been through so much, but now investigators wanted to speak to her, so she remembered as much as she could. The longer they waited, the more Christie could forget everything. It's tough because they know it's best for her to rest, but she won't be leaving the hospital anytime soon. It's going to be a long road to recovery, but they let her know that they're counting on her to tell them what happened. As tough as it is, Christie wants to tell her story. Her last thought when she was inside her pool before being rescued was that she couldn't believe what had just happened. What started out as an ordinary day ended up being the worst day of Christie's life, and now she was about to have to relive it. What I'm about to tell you are Christie's words. This is Christie's story. I'm going to try not to deviate from what she told investigators. This is what I found in legal documents and what I heard her say in her own words in interviews. Christie is alive to tell each and every horrific detail of what this monster did to her on October 15th, 2008. The story actually started a week before October 15th, when Christie and the kids were outside doing some yard work. A man that she had never seen before walked up to her property. He looked like he was in his 40s and had salt and pepper hair. There was nothing really noteworthy about his appearance overall. The man said he was looking for a person who lived in the neighborhood, and when he asked Christie and the kids, they didn't know who this person was. So, the man left. Christie said that she didn't think anything of it at the time, but that same man approached her house a week later, on the afternoon of October 15th, while Christie's kids were at school. Christie was in her yard, on the phone with a friend, when the man came into her backyard. She recognized him as the same man who had come around a week prior, but this time he wasn't asking about someone. He was inquiring about Christie's house for sale. He asked her if she would be able to give him a little tour. He said he was interested in purchasing a home in the area. Christie told her friend, "Hey, I gotta go," and she got off the phone. At first she was hesitant about letting a stranger inside, but she thought to herself, you know what? He's wearing his DirecTV work shirt. And for those who aren't familiar, this is a cable TV company work shirt. So she figured he was probably in the neighborhood just working and had stopped by quickly to look at the house. So she agreed to give him a tour inside, which would prove to be the worst decision of her life. He came inside the home with her, and they started with the living room. Then she showed him the laundry room, which was off the living room. He was just kind of standing behind her the whole time, following her through the house, and he was silent. He wasn't asking any questions, which Christie thought was a little weird. Then she began showing him the bathroom, and that's when things changed. The man grabbed Christie by the neck, held a gun to her head, and told her to do what he said, or no one would get hurt. Christie was shocked and scared. She had no idea what was going to happen, why he was there, or what he wanted. He then forced her into her son Ethan's bedroom, pushed Christie's face down on her son's bed, and put her hands behind her back. He took out zip ties and began putting them on her wrists, tying them together behind her back. Then he used zip ties to tie her ankles together as well. The man was quiet the whole time. He was calm. And then, he took her from Ethan's room and moved her into her own bedroom and forced her to sit up on the bed with her legs and arms still bound. That's when the man began to speak. First, he asked Christie if there were any guns in the house, and she said no. Then he wanted to know who lived there. Christie didn't lie. She told him she lived there with her 3 children. He asked how old they were. Christie said 17, 14, and 5 years old. Again, the man asked if anyone else lived in the house with them, and she said no, it's just us. He asked if Christie was divorced, and she said yes. Then he said, "Are you sure? No one else lives in this house with you?" And Christie again told him no. This next part is strange. The man began to pace back and forth all throughout the house. He was opening and closing the windows, looking outside, looking into her backyard, and Christie had no idea what he was doing. She was hoping that he would just hurry up and take or do whatever he was going to do and just leave. Then he asked Christie when her kids were going to get home from school. This time, Christie did lie. She told him 3:45, even though she knew it would be closer to 3:50 or 4 o'clock. At that point, the man told her that he wanted to smoke a cigarette and that he wanted Christie to smoke one too. Very odd, he put a cigarette into Christie's mouth. She told him, "I can't smoke a cigarette without a drink of tea or Coke. I have to have something." He lit Christie's cigarette, and then he made her take a sip of some kind of alcohol that was wrapped in a brown paper bag. Then he continued pacing up and down the halls, smoking a cigarette. Suddenly, he went across the hallway to Christie's oldest daughter's bedroom, Kayla's bedroom, and he started rummaging through her drawers. He found a pair of Kayla's pantyhose and began cutting them up, then stuck them in his pants pocket. When 3:45 came around, the man seemed irritated that Christie's kids were not home yet. He said, "I guess your kids are late." At that point, Christie asked him if he would just do whatever he was going to do and leave before the kids got home. That's when he told her to shut up. Then Christie asked him if he would let her go to the door when the kids arrived and tell them to go to the neighbor's house, and that she would be over to get them in a few minutes. Again, he said no, and then he told Christie to shut up again. When Christie realized that this man wasn't going to leave before her kids got home, she was really scared for them. She didn't want them to come inside and see what was going on. She didn't want them to come in and see their mommy tied up. At that point, Christie didn't ask any more questions. She tried to stay as calm as she could. She didn't want to make this man mad. She was trying not to make the situation worse. 3:50 p.m. came around and Christie could hear the sound of the school bus pulling up. That's when the man left her room. She couldn't see where he was going. Christie was left on her bed, still bound with the zip ties. A few minutes later, Christie heard the kids come into the house. They were talking about their day, laughing together. Her daughter Kayla was the first she saw coming down the hallway, then Ethan, and then Courtney behind him. When Courtney saw Christie, she said, "Mom, what's going on? Do you want me to untie you?" That's when the man jumped out from behind them, grabbed Courtney, and put her under her head. He forced all 3 of Christie's children into that room with her. He told them to get on the floor and put their hands behind their backs, and all 3 of them did what they were told. They were lying face down on their stomachs. The man began putting zip ties on Kayla's wrists first. When this was happening, little Ethan began to cry, and he spoke up. He asked the man, "What are you doing? Why are you doing this to my mommy?" And he said, "I want to go hug my mommy." Surprisingly, the man said, "Fine, go hug your mommy." So Christie's little 5-year-old son was clinging to her while the man started to tie Courtney's hands behind her back. Then he told Ethan to get up. Ethan asked the man, "Are you going to put handcuffs on me too?" Instead of using zip ties, the man pulled that pair of pantyhose out of his pocket and used them to tie little Ethan's hands behind his back as well. After that, the man took Courtney out of the room first. She had been crying so hard that there were tears pooling on the hardwood floors. He shut the door behind him, and then came back and took Kayla out of the room and shut the door behind him again. I can't imagine how scared they were in that moment. The man came back in once again, and this time he went to take Ethan out. Again, this little boy spoke up. He asked the man, "Why are you doing this to mommy? Why are you hurting her? Are you gonna hurt me? I love my mommy." Christy wasn't able to hold back her tears when she heard her son say that. She was sobbing. Christy told Ethan, "I know you do, baby." It did nothing to deter this man. He took Ethan away from Christy and left, shutting the door behind him again. Christy didn't know where this man had taken her children. She was so worried about them. Soon enough, the man was back in Christy's room. He was still really calm. He actually took a seat right next to Christy on the bed and sighed, kind of leaning up against her. He said, "Okay, it's either gonna be you or your daughter." Christy knew exactly what he meant. It was either going to be that he forced Christy to have intercourse with him, or he was going to do it to one of her daughters. She immediately said, "Please let it be me." I'm so sorry that she had to go through this. Sadly, most times these situations don't end well, and the victims usually do not live to tell their stories. The details that I'm about to relate to you through Christy's words are a lot of things. Repulsive, heartbreaking, unbelievable, terrifying. There are so many emotions that you can only imagine. If we feel these things, how awful Christy must have been feeling when she was going through all this. At this point, the man started to kiss Christy on the mouth. He told her to use her tongue or she'd be sorry. Next, he cut the zip ties off Christy's ankles with a knife so he could begin to position her for his first ultimate violation of her body. He pulled Christy's shorts all the way off, got on top of her, and forced her to have intercourse with him. After he was done, he took her into the bathroom and forced her to take a shower to wash away the evidence of semen from her body. After that, he led her back to the bed and sat there for a while without saying a word. But he finally broke his silence to tell Christy that he was going to have to put her out so that she didn't see him leave. Put her out, well, whatever it meant, whether that meant knock her out or kill her. The man suddenly grabbed her around the neck and began to strangle her. It was like he snapped. He had been calm this whole time, and then, just like that, he became a monster. But I think he had always been a monster. Now he was acting more like one than ever. He wouldn't let go of Christy, no matter how much she fought to get away. When strangling her wasn't working, the man tried to break Christy's neck. Christy fought harder, and when this didn't work either, the man threw her down on the bed and began smothering her with a pillow. Then he pulled out a knife and started to cut her neck, not once, but there were 4 different cuts in different directions across the back, and a couple of times on the front, in both directions, from right to left and left to right. It takes a lot of force to cut this part of the body, unless you're using a very sharp instrument. Even some knives can accomplish clean cuts on the throat. Finally, he let her go and dropped her back on the bed. Christy had no idea where he was going or what he was going to do when he left. But then he came back in and started to stab her again. One of the strikes was into her left ear canal. And he wasn't done. He stabbed her in the lower back as she was just lying there, helpless on her bed. Christy didn't know if he was done or if he was just going to keep going. She had no idea what else this man was going to do to her. At this point, Christy decided her best bet to stay alive was to pretend that she was dead. So that's what she did. She lay there as still as possible. When he came back in, he threw a blanket on top of her body. Christy waited a few minutes before she tried to move. She was waiting for the guy to finally leave. She was lying on the right side, with her ear in a pool of her own blood, and her left ear had been stabbed, so she wasn't able to hear anything. However, once she thought the coast was clear, she slowly and carefully lifted her head a bit so she could see from underneath the blanket. That's when she caught a glimpse of Ethan. He was lying in a room across the hallway. He was lying on top of a pile of pillows, and Christy thought that it looked like Ethan was just lying there asleep, like a tired kindergartner who just got home from school. Christy didn't know what to do, but she wanted to save her children. She was nude from the waist down, so she thought to herself, "Okay, I know what I will do. I'll get up, I'll wrap this blanket around me, I'll run over, scoop Ethan up, and then we've got to get out of here." But Christy realized she wasn't going to be able to do that. Her hands were still tied behind her back. She wasn't going to be able to wrap the blanket around her. She wouldn't get the chance anyway. The next thing she knew, the man was back and he was pouring something onto the floor. He lit a match and set Christie's bedroom on fire. Christie was still afraid to get up. She didn't know where the man went. She was hoping that he had finally left. She was lying there as long as she could, not moving. She was so worried about her children, but the fire started making its way to her bed. Then she felt her right foot was on fire. But to her utter shock and surprise, when Christie tried to move it, she realized she couldn't move her right leg at all. Christie's legs were paralyzed from the deep wounds to her back. Christie had to think fast. The fire was continuing to rage, even larger and more intense. She managed to roll herself off the bed and onto the floor, then rolled towards the French doors that led to the deck in her backyard and down to her above-ground pool. The doors had those lever-type handles, so Christie tried to pull one of the door handles with her foot, but her legs failed her. She tried again, and then she got stuck in the door frame. But somehow she lifted her body and used her foot to push the handle again, and one side of the French door swung open. All the while, her hair was on fire, parts of her skin were burning. The embers falling from the home were landing on her body and all around her, burning her. All she could do was roll, so that's what she did, all the way into her pool. It was such quick thinking on Christie's part, who definitely had the will to survive, especially for her children. At this point, she had no idea where her children were, if they were inside the house or if the man had taken them somewhere. By the time she got out of the house, the entire side that she was on was engulfed in flames. She could hear things popping, cracking, and breaking, and the fire just got hotter and hotter. So much so, she actually had to move to the far side of the swimming pool to get away from the heat. That's when she thought to herself, "I can't believe what just happened." By this time, neighbors had seen the flames. Someone had called 911, as I explained earlier, and now Christie could hear voices on the other side of the house, on the side where her kids' bedrooms were. She was still so worried about them, hoping that the people she could hear had gotten her kids out to safety. Christie tried to yell for help but realized no sound was coming out. Finally, someone came into her backyard and yelled, "We got another one." That's when Christie knew they were going to be saved. She said, "I knew my children were going to be safe. I knew they would get them out." That's when she also recognized a familiar face. It was her friend, Deputy Kenneth Butts. He was the first officer on scene and was right up in Christie's face, trying to help her. That is when he began asking her what happened and who did this to her. Christie told him she did not know the man. The deputy pressed her, asking if she could give a description of what he looked like. Christie told him he was a white man and had been wearing a blue short-sleeve polo shirt with a DirecTV logo on it. The man also wore blue jeans, white Reebok athletic shoes, and had white plastic cable ties and a black handgun. After that, Christie was pulled from the pool, put on a stretcher, and rushed to the hospital where she was saved. Now she was lying in the hospital bed telling this story. I'm sure there was not one dry eye in there, whether they were law enforcement officers just doing their job or not. I'm certain this story evoked emotion in them. Christie was still so shocked and confused, and she still hadn't seen her children. Christie looked around the room, and one of her first questions, of course, was, "Where are my children?" They weren't in the room with her. She couldn't see them. But then one of her friends came forward, John Mark Vincent, the Trigg County coroner. He looked at Christie and said, "We've been telling you that your children are in good hands because they are, but they didn't make it." Christie said, "What do you mean they didn't make it?" She was devastated. She began crying. Everyone in that room was crying too, and they started hugging her. During those days while she was in a medically induced coma, Christie had no idea what happened at the scene of the inferno and what the first responders discovered when they got there. This poor woman had already been through so much. To think that her poor children were also dead is so heartbreaking to me. I almost could not read all these details. Going back to the scene, remember Sean Laurie, the brave man who ran into the burning home? Once it got too hot, I told you he ran back out and then went to the windows to see if there was any way that he could get inside a different way or see anyone. That's when he saw someone's foot, in one of the windows. A foot with a pink sock on it. Sean and other neighbors grabbed a chair and broke the glass, then began to pull the person out of the burning house. It was Kayla. When they grabbed her legs, they were so hot it startled them, so they pulled back. Sadly, when they pulled back, it ripped her skin off into their hands. Can you imagine? Once Kayla was on the ground, away from the house, that's when the neighbors realized her throat had been cut all the way across from ear to ear, deep enough that her trachea was visible. Her legs and arms were still bound with zip ties. She had been gagged with a pair of pantyhose. Karen Walker and another woman began to administer CPR to Kayla, who was miraculously still alive. Karen remembers how Kayla was struggling to breathe, trying so hard to take a breath and gurgling. Deputy Kenneth Butts was there, watching this play out. He knew there was nothing that could be done. The damage to Kayla was too severe. CPR was unsuccessful. When emergency personnel arrived, they put a defibrillator pack on Kayla's heart, but it failed to revive her. Kayla only lived for a few more minutes. Her siblings were still trapped inside the burning house. The fire destroyed the entire home, unfortunately burning Courtney and Ethan's bodies. There was no way for them to be saved. Firefighters from 3 different counties, Linton, Hurden, and Caledonia, were at the scene. They were finally able to put out all the flames by 5:23 p.m. Emergency responders had called Goodwin Funeral Home for the coroner John Mark Vincent to come down. Eventually, Kayla's body was transported to Dr. Deidre Chaluprier, the regional medical examiner for Western Kentucky, for an autopsy. Meanwhile, the state fire marshal's office was contacted to begin an arson investigation to find out the fire's cause and origin. The state police were also involved to investigate Christie's attempted murder. While they awaited the medical examiner's autopsy report for Kayla's cause of death, half a mile of Military Road, as well as some property surrounding Christie's home, was barricaded off with barrels, cones, and yellow crime scene tape. They wanted to preserve the scene and search for evidence, which included a possible weapon. At this point, no names had been released to the public. After all, Christie's children were minors, and with all 3 deceased and having different families, the notification process was more complicated. It was taking more time, and they would not release any information until Kayla, Courtney, and Ethan's fathers were contacted and notified. However, neighbors knew who lived in that home. They knew with 3 people being left inside the home and Christie at the hospital, it had to be Christie's kids that died. So they were talking to the media right away. They were providing names, even though it was an unofficial record. Newspapers were posting pictures of Kayla, Christie, and Courtney. In less than 48 hours, however, little was known about what happened in that home. There was an issue once the fire was put out. They had to locate and remove Courtney and little Ethan, which would turn out to be a very difficult task. The issue was preservation. Since this was no accident, each victim needed to have an autopsy conducted. If the remains were destroyed, that wouldn't be able to be done. So the state called upon forensic anthropologist Dr. Emily Craig. She arrived on scene to attempt to recover the badly charred bodies of Ethan and Courtney and keep them as intact as possible. That is incredible that this can be done. Dr. Craig explained that the remains and the associated debris in this case were so incredibly fragile that she knew they were only going to get one chance to do it right. But she had come up with a plan. By the next day, Thursday, October 16th, Dr. Craig was at the house to carry out this plan. She carefully and meticulously dug a pathway to the bodies to preserve the crime scene. Ethan was discovered first. There was a lot of debris on top of him, including a bed and a ceiling fan, which were directly on top of his tiny body. Courtney's remains were discovered just 10 feet away from her brother. Now for the even harder task of removing each piece of what was left, mostly skeletal at this point. But the doctor managed to recover both bodies, and they were sent to the medical examiner's office in Madisonville. There, the same doctor who was working on Kayla's autopsy asked Dr. Craig for her assistance in the skeletal examination of Ethan and Courtney, which is what Dr. Craig was an expert in. What a process they had to go through. By Thursday evening, State Police spokesperson Dean Patterson confirmed that Kayla's death had been ruled a homicide. Meanwhile, Police and now homicide investigators were canvassing the area, asking neighbors if they had heard or seen anything that day, or any other day, that they thought would be important for the investigation. On the day of the crime, all agencies in the area were told they should be on the lookout for a bloody man wearing a DirecTV shirt. One of the volunteer firefighters came forward. His name was Matt Ledford. He was only 18 years old, but he was a close friend of Kristie's 17-year-old daughter, Kayla. He had a daily routine of coming by her house, saying hello and seeing what everyone was up to. October 15th was no different. He stopped by Kristie's around 4:30 p.m. He parked his car, walked to the front door, and knocked. When no one answered, he opened the door and stepped inside. He said, "I may have stepped inside maybe a foot, a half a foot, that's it." Then he listened to see if he could hear anyone. He didn't, and he didn't even call out or anything because all he could hear was the sound of the swimming pool pump motor. He turned around and left, driving to Hopkinsville, but just as he got into town, he was paged to come out to the fire. He was shocked that it was at Kristie's house. As he arrived back there, he was devastated when he saw the body of his close friend, 17-year-old Kayla Williams, lying near the house, lifeless. Matt stated the scene into the next morning. He only left for about an hour in the middle of the night. "Wow, I can't believe that he was there when this maniac was inside that house. If only he would have called out," he said. "But how incredibly sad. We honestly do not know if his presence would have made much of a difference. He could have been killed too." However, Matt was able to provide a big lead. He told police that when he pulled up to Kristie's that day, there was an unfamiliar vehicle parked in her driveway. It was a champagne-colored 2004 to 2006 extended cab Chevrolet Silverado truck with a trailer hitch. Not only that, Matt remembered the first 3 letters of the license plate. Yep, it was HEY. "That's why I remembered it, because it spelled hay." The things that you never know are going to be important, but it was. They had a description of a white man who might work for DirecTV and drove an extended cab truck with a license plate that started with the letters HEY. Now authorities were searching for this vehicle. Meanwhile, Courtney and Ethan's autopsies were underway. Both deaths were ruled homicides. The damage to 5-year-old Ethan's thoracic bones, which I'm probably saying wrong, the vertebrae, the 33 individual interlocking bones that form your spinal column, showed that force had been used during this attack on his body. One of his ribs was completely split in half. These children were brutally murdered. Ethan was stabbed 11 times, with one of the wounds penetrating his heart. His sister, 14-year-old Courtney McBurney, was stabbed at least 4 times. 3 of the wounds were in her chest and 1 in her neck. Just like her sister Kayla, who was also stabbed in the neck along with a slash across her throat. A serrated steak knife had been broken off of the handle during Kayla's attack, and that blade was found inside her sweatshirt. All 3 of these children's deaths were caused by sharp force injuries. They did not die because of the fire. The fire was most likely started in an attempt to destroy the remains and any evidence of the murders. By Friday, military officials were now on the scene. By that time, Ethan's father, Jeff, had been notified of his son's murder, and he was the one who requested the military's presence. By Saturday, the newspaper revealed that Kayla's father was now on his way from California to Kentucky after being contacted, informed, and interviewed about his daughter's murder. Doug said that he was angered after he learned about all of the deaths. He said, "To think that someone went in there and did what they did to all 3 of those kids. They're an absolute monster, and I hope they find him." He explained that Kayla had recently moved back in with Christie, and that she was the type of girl who would walk into a room, and you would think she was an absolute angel. Courtney's father was also interviewed. He defined his relationship with his daughter as distant and said he regretted that. He no longer had a way to reconcile with her. He stated that he hadn't been in her life for a while, but that he really appreciated other family members for spending so much time with her. He added that he didn't see why this happened. There didn't seem to be a reason for a vendetta. It seemed to be a random act of violence. The whole town was heartbroken for these children and their mother. Police spokesperson Patterson told the media that it was probably one of the most horrendous crimes that he'd ever been involved with or known about in that area, but they still did not have a suspect. However, they were following every lead. The biggest one, he told the media, was the apparent association between the killer and DirecTV cable company. Patterson said that the DirecTV corporate office was fully cooperating with the investigation. This information had the town and the surrounding areas on edge. For one thing, residents were apprehensive about any upcoming cable appointments. They didn't want anyone from that company in their homes. Not only that, men who worked for DirecTV felt nervous because now they were being questioned about something that they maybe had no involvement in. People who had loved ones like their husbands, for example, or family members who worked for the company were now kind of looking at them like, could they be involved? You're right if you think that police have been questioning men who worked for the company. They had actually been told to stop any DirecTV vans that were driving in the areas and question the drivers. One local wife and mother of 3, Stephanie Dunlap, was keeping up to date on the horrendous crime as it unfolded, not only because she too was a mom, but also because her husband, Kevin, worked for DirecTV. She remembered the day that she heard about the fire when Kevin came home from work on October 15th. He told her that he had just been pulled over and questioned by police. She asked him why, and he said it had something to do with a house fire. Kevin told her that the police were looking for someone that worked for DirecTV because apparently, according to what he was told, someone saw a DirecTV van around the scene of the fire. But really, it was a DirecTV shirt that Christie had seen the killer wearing. Nonetheless, this was what was being relayed to people as they were being stopped by police. Kevin, of course, drove a company van during the weekdays, and he said that a bunch of his coworkers had been pulled over that day. Stephanie thought, wow, this is really serious. At that point, not much was being said in the media, and Kevin said that the cops just asked him some questions and then sent him on his way. A couple of days later, Stephanie saw the newspaper article for the first time. The headline read, "3 children dead after house fire." Stephanie couldn't help feeling so bad for that poor family. She thought about how awful it was that they weren't able to get out of that burning house. Stephanie, just like Christie, had 3 children. Her oldest daughter, Brooke, was 13, Kevin Jr. was 11, and little Aiden was only 3 at the time. So it hit close to home for her. It was so heartbreaking for those little ones to lose their lives so young. It was hard for Stephanie not to be invested in the case. It's also a small town, so of course, it's what everyone was talking about. Plus, Kevin was directly related because he worked for a company that was supposedly connected somehow. Or maybe it wasn't, since it wasn't really a van, just a shirt. The police didn't know if the fact that the guy was wearing the DirecTV shirt had any relevance. He could be a former employee, or he could have even gotten the shirt at a garage sale or thrift store. Who knows? No one knew for sure, but they were close to finding out. Although the authorities were staying tight-lipped, they were running with an even bigger lead: the license plate number they had been given for Matt Ledford. From just those first 3 letters, they were able to narrow their search to a specific county where the vehicle was registered. Once they tracked it down and got the information related to the vehicle, it matched the description Matt had given, a Chevy Silverado. At that point, they had the name and address of the owner, and when they did a background check, they found out that the man worked for a company called Rooster and Associates, which turned out to be an independent cable installation contractor. This company had employees who installed and serviced satellite systems for none other than DirecTV in Kentucky. But they were onto something here. Things were adding up. The dots were connecting. Their prime suspect was born in Texas, but had lived in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, for most of his life, and had served in the U.S. Army for more than 13 years, from 1989 to 2002. After being released from the Army, he joined and served in the Kentucky National Guard in Hopkinsville for 2 years. He had been honorably discharged from the elite 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, known as the Night Stalkers. He was a helicopter mechanic and was now working full-time installing satellites for DirecTV. The house at the address related to this vehicle registration was a modest 1-story brick home with a horseshoe driveway that sat on the corner of Cox Mill Road and Sterling Drive in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. It was a 25-minute drive to Christie's house from this location, so investigators wondered what the connection might be. They located the suspect at his place of employment and began to follow him. Starting on that Friday evening, they planned to raid his home the next day, Saturday, October 18th, just 3 days after the murder. They were just waiting on a search warrant and arrest warrant. A DirecTV utility van could be seen parked in the driveway out front of the house that night, and a Chevy Silverado was parked on the other side of the home. By Sunday morning, there were now 2 DirecTV vans outside in the horseshoe driveway, and the SWAT team and several police officers were standing by in unmarked vehicles. They were waiting for a woman and children to leave the premises. As soon as they got the go-ahead with the warrants, they converged on the home. A small explosion was used as a diversionary tactic, and the police set this off before they made their way inside the home to make an arrest. That same day, Stephanie Dunlap had just dropped her 2 older children, Brooke and Kevin Jr., over at their neighbor's house to run some errands with her 3-year-old Aiden, when a neighbor called her to let her know that something was going on. In their usually quiet neighborhood, you know how word travels fast. She said they just heard a loud bang and brought their children inside the house from playing outside. Stephanie rushed back over to the neighbors to make sure the kids were okay, and that's when she saw it. There was a police car parked outside her house. She went over and asked what was going on, and they informed her that her husband, Kevin Wayne Dunlap, had just been arrested. Stephanie had no idea what was going on. 2 investigators showed up right after this and asked her if she knew why they were there. She told them, "No, I have no idea." She was told that her husband had been arrested in connection to the house fire in Roaring Springs that occurred on October 15th. She did not understand. Her mind was racing. She said she was just sitting there trying to understand how her husband could be in any way connected to a house fire. That is when the detectives began to calmly explain to Stephanie that it wasn't just a house fire. The 3 children who had died had been murdered. Their mother had been tied up and sexually violated, and then almost killed. The house was set on fire, but the mother managed to escape by rolling outside into her swimming pool. She was an eyewitness, and the evidence that she and other residents provided to authorities led them to suspect that Stephanie's husband, Kevin, was responsible for this crime. As you can probably imagine, Stephanie was in total shock. She never for 1 second even considered that her own husband would be involved in anything like this. Everything was in slow motion. Stephanie could hardly breathe. One of the things she thought of was that if he did this, then he came home that night, ate dinner with her as a family, and then slept right next to her in bed. It was unfathomable. Could he have really done such a thing? She didn't think he was capable of such evil. She had been married to him for 13 years. By 1 p.m. Saturday afternoon, 36-year-old Kevin Wayne Dunlap had been formally charged with 3 counts of capital murder, 3 counts of kidnapping, 3 counts of tampering with evidence, 1 count of attempted murder, first-degree sexual battery, first-degree burglary, and arson. These charges would be enhanced because a firearm had been used during the commission of the crime. State Police Detective Jerry Jones booked Dunlap into the Christian County Jail in Hopkinsville at 4:34 p.m. that afternoon. Meanwhile, the investigators were scouring the Dunlap home and Kevin's vehicles, including his DirecTV work van, looking for evidence. The Silverado was towed to a crime lab for analysis, and the other DirecTV van that was parked outside the home belonged to Kevin's co-worker, who was actually inside when the house was raided. Both of the men were escorted outside in handcuffs, surrounded by officers, and questioned. Once Kevin was identified, the other man was let go, as he was not involved in the crime. Stephanie didn't know what to think. She did not believe her husband was guilty. When she went to the jail to visit him, she asked him, "Why do they think you committed this crime?" She thought he was going to explain it to her, but he just said it was nothing. She asked, "What do you mean it's nothing? They're saying you killed 3 children." He didn't give his wife an explanation or anything, so she didn't know what to believe. Kevin was a father, a husband. Why would he do this? Well, that's what police wanted to know, And of course, they wanted to interview those closest to Kevin. Here is the information Stephanie provided about her and Kevin's life together. Stephanie was born and raised in Hopkinsville. She was actually introduced to Kevin through some of her neighbors when she was still in high school. He was 5 years older than her, and his demeanor had always been very gentle and kind. She and Kevin were just friends until later on when Stephanie turned 18. He was 23, and they began dating. At the time, she had a 3-month-old child from a previous relationship. Her oldest daughter, Brooke, was treated by Kevin as though she was his own child. Stephanie and Kevin got married 9 months after they started dating, on December 29, 1995. The three of them became a family and did everything together. Kevin was a hard worker in the military, and they were very happy. Stephanie was in love. Over time, they discussed wanting a bigger family, and after about a year and a half together, in 1997, Stephanie gave birth to a baby boy they named Kevin Jr. after his father. Then little Aiden followed about 3 years later. Stephanie said the marriage was normal until it wasn't. Things started to change. Kevin became angry towards the children, seemingly for no reason at all. The first change that Stephanie saw was the way Kevin was treating Stephanie's daughter Brooke, the one that she and Kevin did not have together, but that he raised since she was born. To Stephanie's surprise, Kevin began to be hypercritical of the littlest things Brooke was doing. One example was at dinner one night. Kevin was glaring at Brooke while she was eating. Mind you, this is a little girl, she's a child. But Kevin started aggressively telling Brooke she was holding her spoon wrong. It wasn't the way that Kevin thought it should be held. This poor little girl sat there trying her best to get it right. But no matter how hard her little fingers tried to readjust to his demands, she couldn't do it the way he wanted. It got to a point where Kevin got physical. This was a turning point. Sure, Kevin had been strict and critical in the past, but now he had taken it to the next level. Even worse, if Brooke shed one tear, Kevin would yell, "I'll give you something to cry about." Another thing was food itself. Brooke was required to eat every crumb of food whether she liked it or not, and she couldn't move away from the table until she was done. Sometimes she would have to sit there for hours. So you may wonder, where was Stephanie through all this? She was scared if she fought back and something were to happen to her, there wouldn't be anyone to protect her. Stephanie said she felt the same way. Stephanie had to wait until Kevin went to bed or was taking a shower, then she would come to Brooke's rescue, throwing away all the old food and making sure to cover it up in the garbage so Kevin wouldn't see it. Then she would tell Brooke to go show Kevin that she was done. If she didn't finish, she would get spanked. And many times, that's exactly what happened if Stephanie didn't help her. Stephanie had to smooth things over. What's hard about all this is that there were happy times in between these moments of fear and pain. It was a vicious cycle of push and pull. Stephanie and Brooke both said they looked happy, especially from the outside. Family photos did not show what went on behind closed doors. Kevin became very focused on causing his family pain. His next victim was Stephanie. Sadly, he involved the children in his torture. Not all of us are going to understand this, but Stephanie had a phobia of people touching her feet. Listen, we own our bodies. If something makes us feel uncomfortable, others should respect that and our boundaries. But someone like Kevin used that fear against Stephanie. He pretended it was all in good fun, a game for the kids to play. Let's tickle mommy's feet. So all four of them would gang up on Stephanie as she screamed and told them to please stop. But the kids would follow Kevin's lead until he'd had enough, until he got bored with it, leaving Stephanie feeling helpless and defeated. The kids would listen to Kevin because they were scared of him. He seemed to find pleasure in other people's pain, and things got worse, not better, as the years went on. Kevin became a loose cannon. His family never knew when he was about to blow up. One afternoon, Kevin came home from work. As soon as he got through the door, he demanded to know where Stephanie was. He asked Brooke, "Where's your mother?" Stephanie had been napping. Kevin, for no reason, barged into the bedroom and grabbed Stephanie's hair, pulling her off the bed. Being awakened this way was shocking, to say the least. She had no idea why Kevin was so agitated. That word, remember, the word agitated heaven. Kevin was just throwing Stephanie around the room, hitting her head against the wall and tossing her like a rag doll. All the while, she was crying and telling him to stop. The kids were witnessing this entire ordeal, but he wouldn't stop. He grabbed her, forced her all the way down the hallway as she continued kicking and screaming. The kids were scared, and Kevin started screaming at Stephanie to leave, to get out of his house. He was throwing her outside, but since she knew that Kevin cared about what other people thought, Stephanie figured that if people were around, she would be safer. So she was glad to be outside. She didn't know what she had done to deserve this. She just kept apologizing over and over to him. This was the first time the kids had witnessed Kevin treating their mother this way. Then, as quickly as it started, he would just stop, leaving Stephanie bruised and beaten. But he was the man she loved. Let's try hard not to judge Stephanie too quickly for not leaving. I know some of us may wonder why she didn't just leave him. It wasn't that simple. Even as a child, Brooke wondered why Stephanie would let Kevin treat her this way. She knew it wasn't right, and of course, Brooke had experienced it for herself. Brooke wondered why Stephanie seemed to allow this to happen, and Stephanie explained it was because of her fears. Soon, Kevin began getting physical with Stephanie more and more, but he would always strategically bruise her in places that she could cover with clothing. Stephanie considered reporting Kevin to the police, but she was so scared of what would happen to her or the children if he retaliated. It was a very dangerous situation to be in. At the same time, Stephanie had another job, working hard to make sure her family looked as perfect as possible from the outside. All the family photos, the activities they did together, it all became a facade. Kevin would also be a perfect angel when his mother was around. He acted like a really great husband and father, but it wasn't true. The family was always walking on eggshells around him, and they were pretty good at knowing what would set him off. So the quieter they were, the less trouble they would get into. Stephanie just kept her head down, stayed in college, and knew if she found a way to support herself, she could finally leave Kevin for good one day and be able to take care of the kids on her own. Things reached a whole new level of fear when Kevin started bringing guns into the home. Stephanie was terrified. She had this person who blew up out of nowhere, and now he had more than just his fists as weapons. But Kevin insisted the firearms were just there to protect the family. However, one afternoon, he turned one of those guns on his children. It wasn't a gun full of bullets. It was a pellet gun. The kids actually never told Stephanie at the time. She found out much later. Brooke and Kevin Jr. were in the living room one afternoon when Kevin broke out his pellet gun and began shooting at them. These pellets are made of metal. They burn your skin. Kevin acted like it was funny watching his children squirm. The kids started screaming and telling him to stop, but he just yelled back, "Shut up," and kept laughing all the while as his kids screamed in pain. Then he just turned around and walked out. This next part really terrified and disgusted me. It was Halloween one year, and just like in the years before, Stephanie went out and bought Halloween candy, including Kevin's favorite kind. While Stephanie was at work one day, she helped herself to a few pieces of Kevin's candy. When he got home, he noticed there weren't as many pieces as before and was furious, yelling, "Who ate my candy?" Stephanie was so scared that he would think it was the kids when it was really her, so she quickly told him, "It was me. It was me. I'm sorry." Mind you, this woman went out and purchased the candy for him. It's so twisted how in his mind he has such entitlement and claim over something as trivial as Halloween candy. But Kevin was in a rage. He had to teach Stephanie a lesson. No one eats his candy. Stephanie kept apologizing and telling him, "It's okay, I'll buy you more." But Kevin actually took out a real gun this time and pointed it at Stephanie. She was shocked. She asked him, "What are you doing?" And he said, "How dare you eat my candy?" Then he told her how easy it would be for him to end her life. He wanted her never to touch his things again. His things. Stephanie was begging for her life at this point, over some candy. It's frightening to think that a person holding a gun actually has a twisted mindset where they believe this behavior is warranted. That's the scariest part because you don't know how far they will take it. Stephanie, you just told him she'd never do it again. She repeated her apology over and over until he finally released her. Not only did he walk away, but he didn't talk to Stephanie for 2 whole months. She tried to make normal conversation with her husband, asking him about his day. In domestic situations like this, it's common for the person in control to punish a victim. The silent treatment is one very typical way that they do it. The message they're sending is, "You're not even worth my breath." Stephanie was still sleeping in the same bed, yet this man ignored her. He acted like he had pulled that trigger that day, and that she was dead. But it was also the things Kevin did choose to say that made it hard for Stephanie to leave. Things about how stupid she was, how she wasn't good at anything, how she was worthless, and how she would never be able to survive on her own. There are many ways people try to gain control over others, and one is with their words. Sometimes it's with actual control over something like finances, for example. After years of being told she was worthless, Stephanie started to believe it. She really felt trapped. She felt like she had to stay with Kevin and that there was no way out. She kept thinking maybe Kevin would see the light one day, maybe he would change for the better. But that wasn't the case. It usually isn't. It did seem to get better, though. Kevin stopped being physical with her, but he was hardly around. He began distancing himself from everyone, spending a lot more time by himself, locked up in his man cave, as Stephanie put it. No one knew what he was doing in there. It was a room above their garage in the house. Kevin seemed to sleep less and less and spend more time locked in this room. He wouldn't even eat with his family anymore, which honestly was good for them. No more worrying about holding utensils correctly or being forced to eat when you're already full. They were kind of happy he wasn't around as much. Kevin would go straight to his private room as soon as he came home from work. Stephanie was relieved. She didn't have to deal with him as much anymore. The household was so much calmer. The kids were also getting older, and they would be gone doing their own activities, so Stephanie enjoyed her time alone. She wouldn't even question or care about what Kevin was doing, as long as he wasn't bothering her. She felt good about him keeping to himself. There were times when Kevin wouldn't even come to bed. Some nights, he would be up doing whatever he was doing, unbeknownst to anyone else in the house. Stephanie wouldn't be able to tell if he had left the home either, because he would go right out the garage. Unbelievably, in August of 2004, Kevin and Stephanie actually separated. Perhaps that time alone helped Kevin feel as though it was okay if she left. Stephanie filed for divorce on September 20th, 2004. At this time, Kevin was unemployed. He was attending Hopkinsville Community College and receiving $950 a month through the GI Bill for college and another $813 a month in VA disability benefits. While the court proceedings took place, Kevin and Stephanie agreed to the terms for the custody agreement and other details, like what Kevin would be paying for child support. But, less than a year later, by July 12, 2005, the divorce was dismissed because Kevin and Stephanie decided to stay together. Maybe the time apart brought back fond memories of better times. I don't know. But what I do know is that there were signs that things were not better. Stephanie explained that one night there was a violent storm outside. It woke her up. She noticed that Kevin was not in bed beside her. She wondered where he was, and this time she went looking for him. Where she found him frightened, confused, and disgusted her. She found him in her daughter Brooke's bedroom, in her bed. Of course, Stephanie immediately woke him up. She told him to get up and asked Brooke, who was now awake and confused, why her dad was in bed with her. He hadn't been there when she fell asleep, and it scared her. She was also wondering why her mom was so angry. I think we know why. This was highly inappropriate. Stephanie knew it was something more than Kevin accidentally getting into the wrong bed, and that was concerning. Had he done something to Brooke? No one knew. Brooke said he very well could have, and she could have blocked it out. All she knows is she was never afraid of thunder before that night, but now she was. Kevin had been drinking earlier in the evening, so Stephanie was trying to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he did just kind of wander in there and pass out. All Brooke knew was that now, when she heard thunder, she curled up into a ball and cried, something she hadn't done before this. But now it was a triggered response. Kevin began working again, and he had several jobs, finally landing a job installing satellite TV. Stephanie told the police that she remembers one night Around 9 p.m., she noticed Kevin was kind of getting ready as if he was going somewhere. She was confused. He had his DirecTV uniform on. This time, she asked him where he was going. She already knew there was no way he was going to work. She actually thought he was cheating, so she figured, you know what, let me see what excuse he gives me. Kevin told her, without even missing a beat, that he had a call to go install a satellite system. She kind of snapped back at him, saying, "Really, this late?" He responded, "Well, one of us in this house needs to work," insulting Stephanie as usual. She knew he was lying, but she let him think that she was stupid enough to believe him. They didn't get calls at night to install satellite TV, not that late. Stephanie wasn't stupid, but she let it go. When she noticed how long he was gone that night, she was really concerned. She thought, wow, he's living a double life, probably with some other woman. Not too long after this late-night secret outing, Stephanie came home with the kids one afternoon to see a large amount of blood on their living room floor. She didn't have much time to think about it, because she saw Kevin sitting there holding his hand. It was gushing blood, and Stephanie, in a panic, said, "Oh my God, what happened?" It was a serious cut. Kevin said he cut his hand open while he was working on his truck. Stephanie knew they would need to leave for the emergency room. There was no way this cut was going to stop bleeding without medical intervention. Stephanie just kept wondering why he didn't call her immediately and tell her what happened so that they could get him to the ER faster. Stephanie rushed to get Kevin to the hospital, and once they got there, a doctor started to check out his hand. It was a bad cut, like I said. Of course, they asked Kevin, as they do with every patient, "Tell us what happened here." Kevin explained what he already said to Stephanie. He cut it while he was working on his truck. The doctor looked a little puzzled. He questioned Kevin about his answer, kind of challenging him by saying, "Really? You did this on your truck?" The tone of the doctor's voice indicated disbelief. Kevin repeated, "Yes, that's how it happened." The doctor responded that he was surprised because it was such a clean cut. Stephanie, sitting there quietly and taking it all in, thought the term clean meant it didn't have dirt in it, which was why the doctor was confused. But really, that's not it. In medical terms, and specifically forensic medical terminology, when a cut is clean, it came from a source that can make an even or clean slice. Instruments that create clean cuts are usually very sharp, like knives, whereas a cut that's more jagged could be created by a lot more instances than a perfect one. When doctors see cuts like this, they're trained to alert authorities because they could be looking for a suspect involved in a crime, including a sharp force injury. Accidental cuts are not as precise as wounds that are very clean across and show cleanly divided edges, and may involve different types of tissue with the same contact all the way through, just like one swipe. Kevin did not like being questioned by this doctor, and soon there were a couple of police officers standing in his room. Stephanie was very surprised by the way Kevin was reacting to their presence. The officers just asked him what was going on and told him to explain what happened to his hand again. He told them he cut it on his vehicle and asked why it mattered. He came off very defensive. The officers were like, "Okay, calm down. We're just asking necessary questions here." That's when Kevin kind of snapped back and said something to the effect of, "Why are you acting like I'm lying?" The officers tried to calm him down by explaining that they were just trying to make sure of a number of things. One, that it wasn't someone else who cut him, and that he and his family were safe. Maybe he got into a fight and the person cut him while he was trying to defend himself. It's just their job. Agitated. That's how Stephanie chose to describe Kevin in this instance. She said that she saw him begin to get agitated, and she was familiar with this reaction. When the officers finally left, she did not dare inquire about why it agitated him so much. All they were doing was questioning him. She was scared that he would get more agitated. Stephanie saw the signs. He was beginning to feel the pressure and could be set off at any moment, so she knew when to stay silent. The medical professionals took care of Kevin's cut, and they went back home. It was not too long after this incident that Stephanie found out about the fire in Roaring Spring. She saw that article in the newspaper and remembered Kevin coming home that day and saying he had been pulled over and questioned by police. But he seemed to think it wasn't that big of a deal. Now her husband was sitting in a jail cell. Stephanie knew that Kevin was capable of getting physical with his own family, but she couldn't imagine him having any reason to hurt other people. It just didn't make sense to her. It didn't have to. Sometimes these things never make sense to people who don't think like a killer. But Stephanie did remember something that stood out to her. A couple of nights after she read about the fires in the newspaper, her daughter Brooke had a friend spend the night. They were having fun, watching movies on the couch, and then they made little beds out in the living room, just like most teenagers do during a sleepover. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary to Stephanie. But what she didn't know until later was that Brooke's friend woke up in the middle of the night to see Kevin standing in the living room, staring out the window into the darkness outside. Then, he was pacing back and forth over and over again, as though he was waiting, watching, and acting nervous and scared. Brooke's friend was scared enough that she thought she should say something because it was unsettling. After police arrested Kevin, they sat him down for questioning, and he denied having anything to do with the crime. In his words, he told investigators that he would deny it until the day he died, and that he had nothing to do with it. Well, that's not what investigators thought. They already had their minds made up, and there were solid reasons for that. I'll get to those in just a moment. So they pressed him. One investigator straight up asked Kevin, "Was it an urge? Did it just overwhelm you to do this?" Because as I explained, people who are thinking clearly don't do this. They don't hurt people this way. We want to make sense of the senseless. Kevin just answered with, "I didn't do it," and his arms stayed tightly crossed. He was still wearing his blue DirecTV shirt that he had been arrested in. The investigator didn't back down. He said, "You just showed up in their driveway and went in there and killed them all randomly." They were still trying to make the connection between Kevin and Christie's family at this time. Kevin responded with, "I didn't do anything." He was so calm in this interview. He kept a straight face and was pretty believable. But investigators knew they had their man, so they asked him if he was just going to keep denying this. Kevin said, "Yes, absolutely. I'm going to deny it. I had nothing to do with this." Kevin's pretty convincing, but the evidence doesn't lie. We already know Kevin's Silverado was seen at the crime scene at 4:30 p.m. If he had never been in Roaring Spring, then what was his truck doing in Christie's driveway? Not only that, going back through Kevin's history with his wife Stephanie and the background checks, it was revealed that not only had Kevin been to Roaring Spring before, he had lived there with his family. That is unreal. This man's still trying to deny it. In the fall of 2004, during the time that Stephanie and him were going through their divorce, the Dunlap family was living at 11 Compton Road in Roaring Spring. This was literally 6 houses away from Christie and her family. The proximity of Kevin's former home to the Frensley residence raised the possibility that at the very least, Kevin had seen Christie and her kids before, or their kids could have even played together. The two homes were less than 2/10 of a mile apart. Now let's go to the evidence found at Kevin's residence. The state police crime lab technicians took 21 swabs of suspected blood from that home, including a pair of white Reebok sneakers that appeared to have dried blood on them, and perhaps some ash or soot. These were the exact style shoes that Christie reported the killer was wearing. Police also seized rope, cable ties, several blue polo-style shirts bearing the DirecTV logo, 2 handguns, and copies of DirecTV work orders for October 15th that were thrown in the trash. When presented with this evidence, Kevin finally said that he did have a service order down there approximately 2 weeks before the killings, but he still denied being there on the day of the crime. All the suspected blood that the investigators found on Kevin's shoes and in his truck had to be tested. Meanwhile, they put Kevin into a lineup with pictures of 5 other men and showed these pictures to Christie. They asked her if she could identify the man that attacked her that day. She really examined the photos. She wasn't confident that she could pick out the person who killed her family because, even though she said he resembled the man she saw, she couldn't say with 100% certainty because his hairstyle was a little bit different. It looked like he was trying to cover his hair with his hand in the photo. Christie was also healing from such a traumatic event, losing all of her children and almost dying. She did choose Kevin out of the lineup, but she couldn't be 100% certain it was him. 11 days after Christie almost lost her life, she was finally leaving the hospital to attend her children's funeral. Goodwin Funeral Home coordinated the combined funeral service for all three victims: Ethan Frensley, only 5 years old, and his sisters Courtney McBurney Frensley, 14, and Kayla Williams, 17. Because of the potential for so many people to be in attendance, they decided to have it at the Trigg County High School gymnasium, with the actual burial scheduled for October 31st at the Rose Hill Cemetery in Mason. Kristy Frensley sat in a wheelchair in front of the 3 caskets that belonged to her children. I think I owe it to this mother to read her words, just as she had a friend do at this funeral. She was unable to get the words out herself. I'm sure you can imagine how hard it was. It was too hard, so a friend read what Christie wrote in tribute to her children who were gone too soon. I'm going to read that to you. Every life tells a story. Each life has an introduction, that's the day we were born, a plot, that's the life we live, and a conclusion, our death. Some are short stories, some are full-length novels, and some stories barely have time to introduce the characters before they end. My life story began the day I was born, and my favorite 3 chapters tell of the days that my children, Kayla, Courtney, and Ethan, were born, and I became their mother. When we began our life together as a family, our story has been filled with laughter, fun, adventure, challenges, lots of hugs and kisses, happy times with our friends and family, and plenty of drama, as life will be, living with 2 teenagers and a little kindergartner. Some of you attending today are family and close friends of ours. Many of you here are classmates, teachers, and friends with my children. Kayla, Courtney, and Ethan have been a part of your life story. Since many of you are still in school, you should remember the questions to ask when you read and try to understand a story. Who, what, when, where, and how. Today I want to look at this chapter of my life story and the life story of my children and try to get some answers to questions not only I, but I know you are asking. Who? Who is God, and why did He let this happen to me and my children? God is who He is, not what we want or try to make Him to be. He's not a Santa Claus who writes down a wish list and gives Christians what they want. He never promised that He would protect us from the problems while we're here on this earth. If that were true, everyone would sign up for Him. He will not shelter us from life's troubles, but He will be there with us through them. Where are my children now? All 3 of my children are together and in heaven. I did not lose them. I know where they are. They are alive, completely safe, and perfectly happy. They have beautiful new bodies, and they're waiting for me. What do I do with the anger and rage I feel towards the man who abused my children and me in ways too horrific to describe and left us to die? I know it will be a process for me, but I choose not to give in to hate. If I allow myself to be chained to hate, I will again become his prisoner, and I cannot and will not allow him to have any more control over my life. I just want justice to the fullest extent of the law, and I know that one day my God will judge him for what he has done to our family, and that will be a fearful thing. When will I see my children again? I don't know, but God knows, and He has promised me from His word that I will see them again in heaven. And when we're reunited, there will never be another separation. How am I going to live with this pain and loneliness now that my reason for living aside from my life with Christ is gone? My answer to that is, I don't know. All I know is that God will give me strength to go on, and He's already comforting me by reminding me that the separation from my children is temporary. I also know that God kept me alive for a reason, and I must find that reason. I know Kayla, Courtney, and Ethan want me to go on. The final chapter has been written in the story of my children's lives on earth, but a new story has just begun for them now in heaven with my beautiful Savior. In closing, I know that if Kayla, Courtney, and Ethan could speak to us today, there are a few things they would want to say. 1, we know you will miss us, but please go on. Life is so short and we will only be separated temporarily. 2, do not give in to hate, bitterness, or fear. We know you're struggling to cope with our death. Get help, read the Bible, go to church, get counseling. 3, evaluate your life and invest in things that really count because you don't know when your final chapter on earth will be written. 4, accept Christ as your Savior as we did, You know we weren't perfect kids, but God didn't expect that from us. 5. Mom, Dad, Grandma, Grandpa, aunts, uncles, cousins, and friends, we love you so much. Thank you for everything you've done for us. See you soon. Christie ended by telling everyone, thank you so much for your prayers and support. Wow, I'm sure there was not one dry eye in that gymnasium. I can see why Christie couldn't read that. It was very emotional. About 800 people, including relatives, attended the visitation and funeral. Many of them were classmates and other children from their community. They all walked by the closed caskets one last time to say goodbye. A teacher, classmates, and ministers spoke during the funeral. Pictures of the children and home videos of them were shown on 2 big screens above their caskets, and 3 candles on the gym stage burned throughout the service. Kayla and Courtney had white caskets, and Ethan had a small John Deere green casket that sat between his sisters. Crying could be heard throughout the entire gymnasium, especially when they showed a home movie with Ethan singing the song, Last Dollar, Fly Away, by Tim McGraw. When you listen to that song, think of these children. Kayla played the guitar, and Courtney used the kitchen table as a drum. The first verse of that song is, 1, 2, 3, like a bird I sing, because you've given me the most beautiful wings. Rest in peace, Courtney, Ethan, and Kayla. They were laid to rest, but now justice had to be done. The grand jury heard the evidence that investigators found, the blood on a door handle and a seatbelt. The prosecution said they would seek the death penalty. Kevin pleaded not guilty. The bail was set at $3 million, $1 million for each victim that he had killed. There was enough probable cause and circumstantial evidence presented to get an indictment. Now the real investigation had to take place. They were in waiting mode. It could take weeks, even months, for blood and semen to be tested. The trial was moved out of Cadiz and into a neighboring county, Livingston. There were many pre-trial hearings, as there are with every case of its kind. Christie did not come to many of them, but she was at the pre-trial conference in April of 2009 as the trial approached, which was set for November. Here's a picture of her looking at Kevin as he was escorted out of the courtroom that day. If you look closely, you can see the scars on her neck. She was having to see Kevin in court, and that was really hard on her, but she had to be strong for her children. The evidence was still being tested at this point to get ready for trial. There were suppression hearings because, of course, the prosecution was trying to get certain statements admitted that the defense didn't want, like a statement that Kevin made when the officer showed up at his house, when they were trying to effectuate the arrest, and asked him whether he knew why they were there. He said something to the effect of, "Is it about the Roaring Springs deal? Or the Roaring Spring thing?" This was before he was read his Miranda warnings. Miranda rights stem from the Fifth Amendment in the United States Constitution, and many of us are familiar with the statement. It starts with, "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you can't afford one, one will be appointed to you." The wording can be slightly different depending on the jurisdiction, but Miranda rights were created in 1966 as a result of the United States Supreme Court case Miranda versus Arizona. The Miranda warning is intended to protect the suspect's Fifth Amendment right to refuse to answer self-incriminating questions. It's all about preserving evidence that can be used at trial. That's why we call it pleading the Fifth, because it's the Fifth Amendment. Just because someone is arrested doesn't mean they're guilty of a crime. That has to be proven. But when they're being questioned in relation to a crime, a suspect will be read a warning that essentially says, "If you talk after this, we're going to use your words against you in court." In this case, the prosecution wanted to admit Kevin's 5-hour interview, plus what he said at the door, and they were fighting about this being admitted or not. Ultimately, Judge Woodall said he was not going to allow the statement Kevin made when police came to the door, but the statements during his interview were admissible. With the trial approaching, the defense, of course, filed to delay it so they could do their own independent testing of all the evidence, and because Kevin was undergoing mental health testing. I mention this because there's going to be a bombshell dropped very soon, and I want to highlight what was going on here. The judge granted the delay, especially because this was a death penalty case. It was pushed from November 2009 to February 2010. Let me tell you what was going on behind the scenes, because it was shocking. First of all, Stephanie finally decided to believe that her husband was capable of committing this crime, especially when he wouldn't answer her about why they thought he did it. He said that everything would come out at trial, so she took that as him admitting he did it. They eventually got a divorce. I wanted to mention that Brooke was having a hard time dealing with everything. So finally, Stephanie made a decision to let her know that Kevin was not her biological father. All those years, she actually had no idea that she had no blood relation to this man who raised her since she was a baby. It was actually a huge relief when Brooke sat down with her therapist and her mother, and the truth was revealed to her. She still considered Kevin her father, but it did relieve her to know she did not share his blood. I want to go back to criminals because they have rights. People who are accused of crimes have rights, and our judicial system takes those rights very seriously. Kevin was sent to Kentucky Correctional Psychiatric Center for a 30-day evaluation of his competency to stand trial. A month later, it was found that he was competent. However, just a month before the trial was set to begin, something huge happened that would make this case very unique. Kevin's court-appointed attorney, James Gibson, actually asked the court for an indefinite delay. They needed this for additional testing. The judge responded with this quote, "At a risk of sounding flippant, you need to tell them to hurry up." But Gibson argued it was better to have a fair trial than a fast one, all the while knowing there was something really important that they needed to get to the bottom of without giving it away just yet. While the defense attorney tried to get the judge off the case when he had denied this other delay, he cited a conflict of interest. Remember, Woodall actually presided over the divorce between Kristy and Jeff Frensley just months before the murders occurred, but Woodall declined to recuse himself, saying that that case had no bearing and no effect on this one. Yes, it's true he did decide to grant Christie custody of Ethan just 15 days before he was ultimately murdered, but he presumed Kevin innocent until proven guilty, just like with every other case. He also thought this was a pretty bad tactic of the defense, but maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. Well, just a month before the trial, the Kentucky Correctional Psychiatric Center did a CT scan on Kevin's brain as part of his medical and mental health evaluation, and it raised some pretty serious concerns, ones that the defense had to bring to the judge. This is what the scan found, and I'm probably not going to pronounce this right. They found 2 non-specific hyper-intense punctate foci on Kevin's right frontal lobe. So if there are any doctors or soon-to-be doctors, medical students, and you want to comment, please do. But basically how I understood it in easy-to-understand terms, they scanned his brain and noticed an abnormality, and they wanted to do further testing to find out what it was. Because the frontal lobe of the brain controls judgment, self-control, inhibition, and social interaction, it's a very important part of your brain. Your brain's frontal lobe is the home to areas that manage thinking, emotions, and personality. So it was definitely relevant to have further testing done on Kevin to see what was going on. The defense filed a motion for a complete neurological examination, including an MRI and a PET scan. The judge did approve the request for these exams, but he would not delay the trial. Just as the jury selection was beginning and everyone was there, including Christie and both Doug Williams and Jeffrey Frensley, the fathers of Kayla and Nathan, the judge read the charges and asked Kevin what his plea was. To everyone's surprise, and against the advice of his attorneys, Kevin pleaded guilty to all charges. Judge Woodall asked Kevin why he was pleading this way, and he said he thought it was the right thing to do. Now, because this next part is intense, I want to tell you, it apparently Kevin tried to plead guilty but mentally ill, and the judge rejected that plea. However, in the background of all this, what was happening was a clinical neuropsychologist was set to testify about lesions on Kevin's brain that were found when they did the scans. Dr. Michael Nicholas explained that these lesions were a collection of blood vessels about the size of a cubic inch in the frontal lobe of Kevin's brain. Parts of the cortex, the thinking part of the brain, and the white matter, the communicating part of the brain, were actually missing in this section, which ultimately meant that Kevin could experience things like headaches, depression, and more importantly, it could impair his judgment or cause him to lose control. The prosecution asked Dr. Nicholas why nothing was found when he did his initial evaluation, and he explained that, as a matter of fact, he took note that Kevin's personality did not match the personalities of people who usually commit these types of crimes. That's why he wanted to have him further tested, saying that his personality was different. Well, then the prosecutor argued that people who suffer from depression do not usually commit these types of crimes either. Maybe that wasn't the best argument, but guess what? Ultimately, Judge Woodall accepted Kevin's guilty plea and moved to the next phase, which would determine whether Kevin would be sentenced to life or face the death penalty. Having heard statements from both sides, the judge ruled that he didn't think Kevin was mentally ill, and therefore the plea was going to stand. Kevin understood the charges against him, and he was giving clear statements to the court. Now for the penalty phase. This picture was snapped of Kevin talking to one of the assistant defense attorneys on his defense team during jury selection for the penalty phase. I just wanted to show you, he's just smiling and carrying on like his life isn't hanging in the balance right now. They called 126 potential jurors for questioning. Any extreme opinions for or against the death penalty would get a juror dismissed. It was all about balance. To be as impartial and open-minded, you had to be okay with him getting the death penalty or not, depending on the evidence. 6 potential jurors said that they wanted to see him put to death, and if they served on the jury, they would make sure it happened. Of course, they were dismissed. On the other hand, 2 other potential jurors said that they refused to consider the death penalty. They said they did not want to be responsible for another man's death, regardless of the crime he committed, and they were also excused. There's a picture of Kevin and one of his attorneys chatting on the day these potential jurors were being questioned. Finally, on February 19, 2010, a jury of 8 women and 4 men was seated and ready to hear from both sides. First, the opening statements from the prosecution began with a statement from Commonwealth's Attorney Ove. 3 living human beings on October 15, 2008, he said, standing in front of the pictures of the children. He continued, saying, "Lives worth living, but the evidence shows that this killer took that away." He pleaded with the jury to impose death on Kevin Dunlap, saying that these precious human beings, if ever the facts warranted the imposition of the death penalty, it was these facts. Then he highlighted what I told you happened on the scene that day, including testimony from Sean Laurie, who bravely went inside to try to rescue the children. All the neighbors that I told you about, Karen Walker, through tears, said that she was screaming that there were babies in there. This was an intense day for the jury. They also heard from EMTs, nurses, and doctors, everyone who tried to save Christie, Kayla, Courtney, and Ethan. This is what Kevin looked like that day as he listened. The next day was Christie's turn to bravely take the stand. She told the court everything I told you that she went through, including that final hug from her son, the tears that her daughter cried on that hardwood floor, and how she tried to be brave for them. She says she remembers it like it was yesterday, and I'm sure she will never forget it. She was overcome with sadness to the point that they had to take a break to let her regain her composure. Kevin would not give Christie eye contact, nor would he look at any of the other witnesses. The jury also heard from the medical examiner and the anthropologist. The prosecution also called detectives to showcase all the evidence that was collected, like this shoe found at Kevin's home that tested positive for blood, and the DNA from Christie's vaginal swab that matched Kevin's DNA. This was the evidence against Kevin. A female DNA profile collected from the left Reebok shoe matched Kristy Frensley, and it was estimated to be 1 in 12 quintillion, that's 1 followed by 18 zeros. A Crown Royal bottle wrapped in a small brown paper bag was collected from Kevin's garage. You remember how he had her sip out of a bottle of alcohol wrapped in a brown paper bag? The DNA matched Kristy Frensley's. Swabs from boxer shorts at Kevin's house were consistent with a mixture of Kevin's and Christie's DNA. Inside the driver's seat of Kevin's vehicle, the seat belt had Christie's DNA on it. When it was the defense's turn, starting on February 23rd, they called 3 doctors to testify, including radiologist Dr. Eric Shields. He said that the mass of blood vessels was the size of a ping-pong ball and probably had been in Kevin's brain since he was born. This section of his brain showed no activity on a PET scan. Then neurologist Christopher King said that the odds of a person with this disorder is 1 in 100,000 or even 1 in a million. But when he was asked if he thought it would have affected Kevin's behavior, he said that he could not be sure. He didn't know, but it can definitely cause personality changes, memory issues, and even brain bleeds. The jury finally heard from Dr. Nicholas, who I mentioned earlier, the one who ordered the additional testing to begin with. He wanted to point out that this part of the frontal lobe is responsible for inhibitions. It's the portion of the brain that considers consequences. Antisocial behavior might not have been displayed when Kevin was in the service for the 10 years he was in the Army because it was so disciplined, but he couldn't say for certain if it did or did not cause him to commit these murders. He said that some people can still function normally and have right frontal lobe abnormalities. As a rebuttal witness, the prosecution called Dr. Amy Trivett, a psychiatrist from the Kentucky Correctional Psychiatric Center. She conducted the competency test on Kevin. She said the lesions were incidental and that nothing suggested they had any effect on his behavior. He knows the difference between right and wrong and can conform his behavior according to the law. Someone else was in that courtroom to testify. Kevin's own mother, the one he used to play nice with, the one he would act like a perfect husband in front of, Sheila Dunlap. She said she couldn't believe it when she heard that Kevin had been arrested for the killings. She said she was stunned and said, "I couldn't believe it because I know his heart and I know how much he loves children." She testified on behalf of her son. She told the jury he didn't have a normal childhood because he had a domineering father. However, she did mention some similarities in Kevin, like his father's need for the children to be perfect. He was very strict on him. In closing, the defense attorney argued to the jury that Kevin shouldn't be put to death. The death penalty wasn't the answer, that he had mental health issues, and they pleaded with the jury to think of Kevin's own children. His 7-year-old son wouldn't understand the death sentence of his father. Think of the effect the death penalty was going to have. He said, "Their father killed some children. Killing is wrong, and to show that killing is wrong, they kill him." Does that make sense to a 7-year-old? Some children, huh? They were more than some children. They were Kayla Williams, Courtney McBurney Frensley, and Ethan Frensley. Now it was in the jury's hands. 3 hours later, they were ready for their verdict to be read. Their recommendation, a death sentence for each of the children's killings and for each of their kidnappings. So 6 death penalties in total. Here is Christie when the verdict was being read. Army Major Doug Williams, Kayla's dad, said he wanted to say something to Kevin, and he would when he was sentenced. He told everyone that the most important thing in his life was missing now, and there was never going to be repayment. Nothing replaces the pain that Christie, he, and her stepmother and stepfather Jeff would have to endure from her being dead. Finally, the day was here, March 19, 2010, when Kevin was officially sentenced to death, in addition to 3 life sentences and 55 years for what he did to Christie. Judge Woodall said, "Given the severity of all the offenses, I'm imposing the maximum sentence allowed on all counts." Now for what Kayla's dad said to Kevin. He said, "You are nothing but a hollow shell of what was possibly once or should have been a man. However, you're not a man. Instead, you're a coward and a monster. You're nothing but pure evil that attacked helpless and innocent children and their mother." He went on to say that even though he's a Christian, he can't forgive Kevin. He wants Kevin to one day explain his actions and to confess to any other crimes he may have committed. Doug said that nothing brings him more pleasure than seeing Kevin sentenced for the crimes he committed, and the only regret he had was that he wasn't allowed to determine Kevin's punishment on his own and carry it out as his personal executor. Kevin sat there emotionless. Doug went on to say, "I still find it hard to understand how you can sit motionless, emotionless, and void of reaction as the many photos and accounts of the aftermath of your crimes were described in great detail to this courtroom. It's clearly evident that you have no remorse for your crimes against my family and this society." Here's a picture of Christie with the prosecutor, who Christie referred to now as part of the family. Stephanie had an assumption about why she thought Kevin may have committed this crime. She said that she saw similarities between their family and Christie's family. For example, 3 children of similar age groups, and the fact that he could have possibly tried to become sexual with Stephanie's daughter, Brooke, in the past. Perhaps Kevin had a fantasy about that and found a family to carry out that fantasy, considering Christie had 2 young daughters. Remember what he said? It's either going to be you or your daughter. Not to mention the fact that he seemed to want to harm his family, but perhaps if he had, it could have been too obvious that he was the perpetrator. Maybe he thought that he could get away with it, and he had this pseudo-family to carry out these heinous crimes upon. The fact that he lived in such close proximity to Christie's family also suggests that he could have seen Christie and her family before, and maybe he didn't like that they were seemingly happy while he was so unhappy in his situation. But we will never know. The judge remanded Kevin to the custody of the Kentucky Department of Corrections and said, "Good luck to you, sir." Kevin got an automatic appeal to the Supreme Court following his death sentence. It's actually mandatory in Kentucky. I read this long document submitted on August 15, 2011. It was 173 pages. I'm going to spare you, but it is very interesting. I will paraphrase, just to let you know that the defense mentioned the fact that there were only 6 days before the trial when they got these additional scans done. The clinical psychologist, Dr. Nicholas, whom we already heard from, reviewed these results and believed that the lesion was very significant and would have impaired Kevin's capacity in terms of self-control and judgment. There was so much literature about the abnormal behavioral consequences of frontal lobe lesions. They just didn't have time to present them to the court because the judge refused to delay the trial so that they could prepare. There were all types of things shown in this report. Stuff about Kevin's personality, who he would have been, that he didn't even commit violent crimes in the past, and he didn't have a tendency to act out towards others. But according to doctors, he had a normal life. He was married, he held a job. In this appeal, there were pages and pages about his disorder and previous head injuries and traumas when he was in the Army. I'm not going to go into all the details, but they were just trying to prove that Kevin really didn't know what he was saying in court when he answered certain questions. To cut to the chase, the appeal was denied and the death penalty was upheld, so he stayed on death row in Eddyville, Kentucky. But this man's team will not quit. Just last year, they once again were filing motions for a new trial, saying that there was insufficient counsel and it was still ongoing. The last time I checked, they just want the death penalty overturned. Look at this man. He's 50 years old in this picture, and he is where he belongs. I want to end with Christie and her words. She said, "When you lose your kids, I don't think you ever heal emotionally. It's just something you never get over." But despite her grief, she wanted her story to be told because she hoped it would help others who may have gone through something like this. Maybe someone has lost a child or children, and this could help them. She knows her story is sad, but she survived because of how much she loved her children. She fought to stay alive for them. That is what kept her alive. I'd like to begin by sharing some information about Diane Grant. Diane Ruth Grant was born in 1963 and raised in Estill, a small town in Hampton County, South Carolina. Diane's mother, Sarah Bowen, was still a teenager when Diane was born, so she was brought up by her father's family. The community they lived in was very close-knit, with a population of just over 1,800 people, where everyone knew each other. Unfortunately, there isn't much available about Diane's childhood or teenage years, but I've gathered what I could. From what I know, Diane was deeply cherished by her extended family. She was known to be quiet and reserved, yet also warm-hearted and generous, with strong family values. She often spent time in the neighboring towns of Gifford and Scotia, which were even smaller than Estill, with populations in the few hundreds. These towns were only about a 10-minute drive from her home. When Diane was in her late teens, she started dating a man from Gifford named Willie Lee DeVore, who was around her same age. The couple welcomed their first son, Marquess, in 1982, when Diane was 19 years old. and it appears the couple went on to get married. The day after Christmas, December 26th, in 1987, 24-year-old Diane gave birth to a second son that they named Jatavius. Then on July 16, 1992, Diane and Willie's daughter was born, a little girl they named Deanna. Diane, of course, loved all of her children equally, but when Deanna came along, she was thrilled to finally have a daughter, a mini-me that she could dress up and one day look forward to all sorts of mother-daughter bonding activities that would cultivate a deep and loving relationship between girls and their mothers. Marquise was a very protective older brother, and Jatavius was his best friend. The boys felt even more protective of their sister Deanna because she was the baby of the family and also because she was a girl. The parenting dynamic in the DeVore household was one that many of us can probably relate to. Willie was your classic, easygoing, fun dad, while Diane was the one who kept the kids in line, but always in a positive and loving manner. By this time, Diane had been in touch with other people from her past, one whom she had never known even existed. As I mentioned, Diane had been raised by her father's family, but in her early 20s, she decided she wanted to reconnect with her mother, Sarah, who lived out in New York. After they started communicating once again, Diane got a huge surprise when her mother told her she had a brother that was 1 year older than she was, and he lived out in Connecticut. Diane could not believe this. The news was a shock in a lot of ways, but it was also an unexpected opportunity for her to get to know someone with whom she shared DNA and hopefully forge a close bond. This is happening more and more with sites like 23andMe and Ancestry, and I always wonder if I have any unknown siblings out there somewhere. But Diane got in touch with her brother, and they began gradually getting to know each other through emails and phone calls. They knew that one day, when they both felt comfortable, they would eventually meet. Sadly, around 1995, 32-year-old Diane and Willie's marriage came to an end. Marquise was 13, Jatavius was 7, and Deanna was just about 3 years old. Unlike so many couples, where things become difficult and hostile and the parenting arrangements break down, Willie and Diane were different. They managed to co-parent really successfully. Their kids were still so young, so they knew the most important thing was staying amicable and keeping disruption in the kids' lives as minimal as possible, ensuring they felt happy, safe, and loved at all times. They thought just because things didn't work out between them as a couple, this in no way meant they weren't 100% committed to being the best parents they could be. Marquise, Jatavius, and Deanna split their time between two different households, but this in no way diminished how loved they felt by their parents. The five of them were still a strong family unit, even if Willie and Diane were no longer in a romantic relationship. Now, also dealing with the challenge of a changed financial situation, in addition to being a single mom, Diane often worked 2 jobs to make ends meet and provide the best life she could for her kids. Whether she was working at a florist, a plastic manufacturer company, or even a record company at one stage in life, she commuted to work as a housekeeper in the resort destination of Hilton Head Island, something she couldn't have done had she not had the support of her extended family to help look after the kids. And of course, Diane was exceptionally grateful to have that network around her. Her co-workers at the plastics factory knew her as a go-getter, someone who was always busy and in 10 places at once. But she was also the kind of person who knew how to see the positive side of situations and overcome her hardships, no matter how tough they might be. Her childhood friend, Charles Hosendo, who attended school with Diane and went on to work with her at the plastics company, said that Diane was never really bothered by much, and if she was, she wasn't the sort of person to make it known. In late 2001, 38-year-old Diane was presented with a new job opportunity, and she accepted a role at another manufacturing plant. Her co-workers threw her a farewell party. They were going to truly miss her professionalism, kindness, and of course her friendly face. Not everyone gets a farewell party when they leave a job, but Diane's new role wasn't in Ford. It was actually 90 miles away in the city of North Charleston in Dorchester County. This is the southernmost part of South Carolina, in the heart of what's known as the Low Country and part of the broader Charleston metropolitan area. The first time that I was ever really introduced to the Low Country was when I was watching the Alec Murdaugh trial. So you may be familiar with this part of South Carolina if you followed that case. This is a historic, sprawling area, but it's one of the poorest regions in the state, unfortunately. As the third largest city in South Carolina, North Charleston straddles multiple counties, Charleston, Berkeley, and Dorchester, where Diane and her youngest kids were going to move. The city, which is northwest of Charleston itself, is situated between two rivers, with the Ashley River to the west and the Cooper River to the east. North Charleston has a rich but complex history and cultural diversity among its residents. It was originally built off the exploitation of enslaved African people who arrived in the area via the slave trade. Over time, it continued to grow on the back of the agricultural industry. After its naval base was established at the turn of the 20th century, it also became home to a growing manufacturing and industrial sector. But of course, a lot had changed over the years, and in 2001, 38-year-old Diane, 14-year-old Jatavius, and 9-year-old Deanna made the move to see what awaited them. It was no doubt going to be tough for Diane, being a single mom and moving so far away from her support network, but she was up for the challenge, and she could see the opportunity was ultimately for the benefit of her children, with access to better education and better jobs. Even though they weren't moving out of state, it was no doubt a little bit scary and an uncertain time for the kids. North Charleston was home to over 81,000 people, way more than they were used to growing up in a very small town. The kids were also leaving behind everything they'd ever known, including their dad and their older brother Marquise, who was now 19. He decided to make an even bigger move, heading down to Florida on his own. Not long after arriving in Jacksonville, Marquise met a 19-year-old woman named Sonia, who would go on to become his wife. Sonia was hanging out, having a meal with her dad when Marcus spotted her, and he was immediately struck by how beautiful Sonia was. Marquise introduced himself, and of course, Sonia probably thought he was just as good-looking. With his bright greenish-blue eyes and olive skin, he definitely stood out in a crowd. They made a gorgeous couple, and soon they began seriously dating. It wasn't long before he and Sonia fell in love, and after about a year together, they took the plunge and moved in with one another. Meanwhile, Diane and the younger children had moved into the Archdale Forest apartment complex at 99 Shagbark Trail in North Charleston. The complex, which had on-site property management, consisted of 328 apartments and townhomes, divided up into multiple larger buildings, with around 5 dwellings in each building. Shagbark Trail looped around the complex, so the quiet wooded area had a cozy community feel where everyone looked out for one another. Kids hung out in the playground, by the pool, or in the picnic area, and people would wave to one another and walk their dogs. Residents felt really safe there, and there were minimal, if any, problems in terms of criminal activity. Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna quickly settled into their apartment, 2113B. Diane worked hard at her new job to provide for her children and give them the best life she could. She was driven and intelligent, and despite working long hours, she put her kids first. She took immense pride in herself, especially in her appearance. Even though she worked these long hours, she knew how to keep herself together. She always made it look effortless as well. She was very classy and beautiful. Around 2004, she took a new job in quality control at the Robert Bosch manufacturing plant, working the second shift, which was great because it was only a 4-minute drive away from their home. The 40-year-old was soon a valuable and highly respected part of the team, and she stood out to her shift supervisor, Anthony Gillard, who described Diane as a stellar performer. Diane was always friendly and helpful as a neighbor, and she instilled these same qualities in her children. They were always there to lend a hand to others, and this is exactly how Jatavius met a lot of people in his community, especially some of his closest friends. He was known as a bit of a class clown, but like his mom, he was kind and generous. One day when Jatavius was driving home, he spotted his neighbor, 18-year-old Usha Mackey, walking around carrying a big laundry basket as she headed home. Jatavius pulled over and offered her a ride, and from then on, they were really close friends. Living so close to each other, they began hanging out regularly. Usha and Jatavius would either hang out at Diane's place or at another apartment nearby, and because the group didn't have to go far to walk home, it became quite usual for them to stay up well into the early hours of the morning, just talking, hanging out, and spending time together. Diana, meanwhile, was growing into a young woman and developing a solid sense of self, which we know can be difficult during those awkward teenage years. Unlike her mom, Diana wasn't quiet. She was quite a chatterbox. Her grandmother, Sarah, described her as very outspoken, which made Diana popular at school. She made friends easily, especially in the apartment complex, thanks to her outgoing personality and very sweet, respectful manner. One neighbor, Tia Thomas, thought of Diana as her own daughter, given her close relationship with two of the Thomas girls, who would go roller skating together and play around the community. As community-minded as Diane and her children were, they were definitely not the kind of neighbors to cause drama or to bother anyone. They didn't open the door to anyone they didn't know, but they were always there to help anyone who needed it. Now let's shift to what's happening down in Florida. Marquise and Sonia just welcomed their first child in 2002, a daughter, and then in 2005, Sonia gave birth to their son. Diane was, of course, ecstatic. She was now a grandma and couldn't do enough for her oldest son's growing family. But it was also hard on Diane being states away from her grandchildren. Like many young parents, Marquise, who was employed by a trucking company, and Sonia both had to work to pay the bills. When their children were old enough to go on a road trip to Diane's, she jumped at the opportunity. So, in May of 2007, Diane drove down to Jacksonville, Florida, to pick up her grandkids and drive them back to South Carolina, where they would spend the entire summer with her, their Aunt Deanna, and Uncle Jatavius. This would give Marquise and his wife a much-needed break to enjoy themselves as a couple. Sonia held her mother-in-law in high regard. She saw Diane as a very strong woman, a remarkable, elegant, strong mother who was very educated, and her beauty radiated from within. Diane really made a lasting impression on Sonia, who actually aspired to be like her and emulate those same qualities one day. Sonia, of course, trusted Diane with her children, and Diane promised to call Sonia and Marquise every day so they could speak with their kids while they were away that summer. Life was good and busy for 44-year-old Diane, her kids, and now her grandkids. Even though it had been years since her move, she still called in to visit her former co-workers back in her hometown. In early July, she and Deanna actually took a trip back to Gafford to visit Willie. But the hard-working single mom was about to mark an exciting and momentous milestone. Remember how I said that Diane had been in touch with her brother, whom she'd never met? Well, by now, they had agreed it was time to finally meet. Diane was super excited and looked forward to seeing her brother in the flesh for the very first time in the coming week. She figured that once her grandchildren had returned home to Florida after the summer, she would go up and see her mom, Sarah, in New York. Deanna had visited her maternal grandmother the previous Thanksgiving, but Diane hadn't seen her mom in a while. By this time, 20-year-old Jatavius had moved out of the apartment and was enrolled in the Job Corps in Bamberg County. But in early July, he came to stay with his mom, his sister, his niece, and his nephew for a visit. Diane was thrilled to have so many of her loved ones under the same roof at the same time. 14-year-old Deanna was eagerly counting down the days to her 15th birthday. She loved taking her nephew for walks around the complex, pushing him along in his stroller, and waving to people she knew along the way. She had recently finished up at Oak Brook Middle School, where, on the last day, her principal, Principal Garland Crump, gave Deanna a hug and wished her luck in high school. Principal Crump would never forget Deanna. She flashed him a big grin and responded, "Mr. Crump, I will make you proud." Deanna was, of course, looking forward to starting 9th grade at Fort Dorchester High School. Most importantly, like many teenage girls, she wanted to have her high school wardrobe on point well in advance to make a good impression. A KRS shoe store had recently opened in the nearby mall at the Festival Center, and that's where you would often find her. She would spend her time browsing the many styles and colors for sale, She was there so much that she got to know the store's co-owner, Robin T., who could tell that for Deanna, it was like being a kid in a candy store. Robin trusted Deanna so much that if she was busy with a customer and Deanna was there, Robin would occasionally have Deanna go fetch shoeboxes from the back room and bring them out to customers to try on. One particular style that had caught Deanna's eye was a pair of bright yellow closed-toe pumps with nearly a 3-inch heel. It was easy to see why Deanna was drawn to these striking shoes, but Robin told her young customer she wouldn't sell them to her without her mom, Diane's approval. So on July 9th, before school started, Mom and daughter went to the shoe store to go shopping. Deanna was super excited when her mom agreed to let her purchase those yellow pumps that she had been obsessing over. It was going to be the perfect start to the school year, but sadly, no one knew what was about to happen next. In the early hours of the following morning, on July 10th, Archdale Forest resident Scott Morgan awoke to what sounded like a crack of a gunshot. Then he heard a scream and 3 more shots echoing around the apartment complex from wall to wall. Scott tried looking out his windows to see what was going on, but they were all fogged up due to the condensation from the air conditioning that he had running through the hot July night. Scott wasn't sure what he had just heard. At the same time, another resident, Matthew Rogers, was watching TV in bed with his fiancée when he heard the same thing. Except, the gunshots after the scream sounded like they were coming from directly behind Matthew's apartment building. Matthew called 911 at 2:24 a.m. He told the operator he and his fiancée were afraid to look out the window. They didn't want to draw attention to themselves if someone had a gun and was on the loose. Another caller reached out to the police, saying that there were gunshots outside of her apartment. Getting a call like this from a neighborhood like this one was actually very unusual. It was known as a safe, quiet community. Worcester County Sheriff's Deputy Patrolmen Adam Smith and Joel Crisp were alerted and soon responded to the location in separate patrol cars. As Deputy Smith made his way onto Shagbark Trail, he kept an eye out for any suspicious vehicles or people that could be fleeing the scene. As he drove around the loop to his left, he saw an apartment door that was open in Building 213, and he could see a light on inside. So he radioed to Deputy Crisp to join him so they could approach the front door of the apartment together. It was apartment 2113B. Deputy Smith slowly approached the door from the right, with Deputy Crisp on the left. As the officers moved closer, Deputy Crisp could see inside the apartment right away. He saw what appeared to be 2 people lying motionless on the ground inside, about halfway between the kitchen and the back door, and both of them appeared to have suffered trauma to the head, possibly from a gunshot wound. Given that the resident Matthew Rogers had called 911 reporting gunshots, the deputies had no idea if someone was wielding a gun and was still inside the apartment. So they held their position and notified other responding units, including emergency medical services, who were quickly on their way. Sergeant Hill and Deputy Buckman soon arrived together. The 4 officers went inside the apartment unit. The layout was long and narrow. As they walked into the front door, there was a staircase to their left, and to the right was the kitchen with a narrow pathway leading into the dining and living room area. The first body that the officers saw as they made their way inside was that of a woman. Then, as they moved further into the home, they saw another person lying next to the couch in the living room area. It was the body of a young man lying half on his stomach and half on his right side. There were no signs of life from either of the 2 victims. The officers began to secure and clear the residence. They were satisfied that there was nobody else downstairs, so they made their way up the stairs to where the bedrooms were. That's when they noticed there were 2 young children in one of the rooms, and they appeared to be asleep. But of course, they weren't sure if they were also victims. So the officers moved closer and realized that both of them had been spared. They were just asleep and alive. One was a 5-year-old little girl, and the other was an 18-month-old little boy in his crib, but they were completely unharmed. Deputy Smith and Buckman carried the children downstairs and placed them in a patrol car. Shortly thereafter, the children were taken into custody by the Department of Social Services, until other family members could be contacted. I cannot imagine how traumatizing this would have been for these little children to be woken up by police officers not knowing what was going on. Meanwhile, George Tesser County Coroner Chris N. Bett arrived at the scene and unfortunately pronounced both the man and the woman found in the living room dead at the scene. Officers had an idea of who may live in this apartment building based on the mail they found inside, but they weren't 100% sure of the deceased female's identity at this point, nor how the two victims had died. But it appeared they had both been shot in the head, based on what they gathered from the mail and speaking with the property manager on site. The residents who lived there were 44-year-old Diane Grant and 14-year-old Deanna DeVore, and that Diane's young grandchildren were visiting for the summer. At first, the investigators believed that the female lying on the ground in the living room was Deanna, and that Diane wasn't home. Detective Earl Asel of the Dorchester County Sheriff's Office Crime Scene Unit arrived on the scene after being advised that at least one murder had occurred, with the killer possibly taking their own life. This was the assumption, given the finding of the male and female inside, without an understanding of who these people were. Because that was the working theory at the point, Detective Asel began taking photographs and processing the apartment for evidence. On the floor near the encounter, he found and collected two .40 caliber Smith & Wesson shell casings. A significant amount of blood spatter was on the back of the front door, and this initially suggested that the victims may have been beaten. But the female victim had a hole in her left cheek that appeared to be an exit wound, which accounted for that spatter. The bullet had then entered the wall on the right-hand side of the dining room table, 2 feet and 9 inches from the floor, exiting into an apartment next door. So, Detective Asel went to that apartment to ensure no one else was hurt after the bullet traveled through the wall. Thankfully, it lodged itself into a drawer and didn't harm anyone else. Crime scene technicians did a gunshot residue test on both bodies. The fact that there didn't appear to be any firearms in the apartment now made it clear that this was not a case where someone shot the woman and then took their own life. No, this was a double murder. The victims were then transported to the coroner's office, and the officers were still unsure of their identities. But whoever had shot the victims had either brought the weapon with them or potentially stolen it from the home. But there was no sign of forced entry into the apartment. Someone, perhaps the killer but not the officers, had left 2 impressions of dirt on the floor between the kitchen and the dining room. So, Detective Asel obtained 2 gel lifts of these impressions to see if they could determine the type and size of shoes of the potential killer. A gel lift is a thin film with tacky rubber gel with backing on the other side. It's placed onto a shoe impression and then peeled up to lift the impression from the floor. Basically, it's a lot like fingerprinting, but for shoes to determine things like make, style, and size, and sometimes any unique tread marks from the circular pattern on the ball of the foot and heel. In this case, the detective took an educated guess that the shoes were Nike brand Air Force One sneakers or something with a very similar tread design. There were a pair of men's size 10 Nike Air Force One sneakers right next to the couch in the living room, and they seemed to have the same pattern as the shoe impressions on the floor. Both this pair and another pair were taken in for analysis, along with the gel lifts. The detectives then took blood swabs and fingerprinted the counter, where he could see that somebody had touched it. He also took swabs from the door handles and the dining room table, which had high-velocity blood spatter and some strands of hair on it, which was most likely a result of the shot to Diane's head. Detective John Garrison of the Dorchester County Sheriff's Department arrived, and he was the lead investigator, assisted by Major Mike Turner and Sergeant Michael Miller. Detective Garrison was surprised to learn that there had been reports of a shooting at Archell Forest. This wasn't a neighborhood known for violence, let alone shootings. The Charleston County Sheriff's Office and the North Charleston Police Department were also there to assist. Detective Garrison began organizing officers going door to door to find and interview neighbors who had called 911, including Matthew Rogers. They also dispersed to conduct a general canvass of the entire neighborhood to inquire if anyone had seen or heard anything. While only a couple of 911 calls came in, numerous residents had heard the commotion outside. But the fact that it all occurred in the dead of night meant that none of these residents had actually witnessed anything, nor had they heard any vehicles speeding off. Like other residents, Janice AMT told the officers that she thought someone was actually setting off fireworks close to the back porch of her apartment. She said that if she had thought for a second it was gunshots, she would have left her apartment, gone across the street, and got one of her neighbors, who was actually a sheriff's deputy. The complex's on-site property manager spoke to the investigators again, and after a description of the victims was given to her, she explained that the residents of 213B were initially Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna. However, based on the information provided to her by the detective, she believed that it was most likely the mother, Diane, and the son, Jatavius, who were the victims. But then, where was Deanna? She wasn't in her bed, so was she staying with a friend? Or, even worse, what if she had been abducted or somehow involved and was now on the run? These cases can really go in any direction, so officers fanned out across the apartment complex to see if there was any sign of the missing teenager. Tragically, it wasn't until the sun began to rise that investigators would get their answer. Around 6:30 a.m., two detectives found the body of a young female lying on the muddy ground behind Building 105, next to an electrical box. She was wearing a tank top, but was naked from the waist down and barefoot. A pair of pajama bottoms with a pair of underwear were inside and placed on top of the electrical box. She was preliminarily identified as 14-year-old Deanna DeVore. The seasoned detectives had seen a lot in their careers, but still, nothing prepares you for seeing something like this. It was just horrendous. They noticed that she had managed to run quite a bit away, since Building 105 was separated from Building 213 by a road, a small ravine, and 3 other apartment buildings. They wondered why she was so far from her home, but they theorized that she was, of course, running away from a killer. She could have also been trying to get the young children out of harm's way by luring the killer far away from the apartment where the children were sleeping in their beds. She was lying on her side, and it appeared as though she had been shot several times at close range. It also looked like she might have been the victim of a forced sex act due to her clothing being removed. In the grass near her body, there were 4 Federal brand .40 caliber shell casings, and underneath her body were 2 bullets of the same caliber. There were also shoe prints in the ground that had been disturbed, as if there had been a struggle of some kind in that area. As with Diane and Jatavius, the detectives conducted gunshot residue testing on Deanna, and they decided to take cement castings of the shoe prints that were in the mud. Back at the apartment, with the advantage of daylight, the detectives noticed even more shoe prints in the mud near the front door, and those were also collected. It seemed they had the same sole pattern as the ones that were inside the apartment, plus there was a footprint left there as well. At the sheriff's office, the 6 shell casings were processed for latent fingerprints, but none were found. Once there was an official identification made of the 3 victims, the officers had to break the devastating news to Diane's surviving son, Marquise, and his wife, Sonia, down in Florida. Their children were visiting Diane. She'd been caring for them for the past 6 weeks or so. Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna had all been killed. It's the most unbelievable, unexpected, and heartbreaking news a person can get. That's basically their entire family that had been murdered. Before Marquise even got the call, he was driving to work that morning, just driving along, when suddenly he said he was overcome with a wave of emotion and just burst into tears. The 25-year-old was confused about why he was feeling that way. It was not like this man to just start crying out of the blue, but he knew that something had to be wrong. He had no idea what it was. When Marquise arrived back at the office, a detective from the Jacksonville Sheriff's Department was there to talk to him. She broke the news to Marcus, who was stunned. 3 of the most important people in his life were dead in a homicide. As Marquis struggled to come to terms with his shock and disbelief, his thoughts quickly turned to his own children. He knew that he would be a complete wreck after hearing that news, knowing that his children were in that house. An immense wave of relief washed over him when he was told that his kids were safe and temporarily in the care of social services. There were so many thoughts and emotions for Marquise to process, and his wife Sonia felt exactly the same way. When he had to break the news to her, she just kept repeating, "Who would do this? Why? Why?" Then her concern quickly turned to their 2 children. Without hesitating, the heartbroken couple jumped in their car and made the drive to South Carolina. They were still trying to make sense of who could have possibly done something like this to their family. None of them had any enemies. They worked hard, studied hard, and lived good, honest lives. Marquise and Sonia weren't the only ones trying to work out what had happened. Diane's ex-husband, Willie, was just as shocked and heartbroken when he learned that his ex-wife and 2 of their children had been gunned down in cold blood. At the same time, Detective Garrison needed to make inquiries as to whether Diane's ex-husband Willie knew anything about the incident. As we know, it's those closest to the victims who are often involved. Even though Diane and the younger kids had moved away from Gifford, there had still been a marriage that broke down. Even if an ex-spouse isn't involved, they need to be eliminated as suspects. So, Willie told investigators he was just as confused as Marquise about who could possibly have done this, who would target his family in such a brutal way. He flatly denied having any involvement in this crime. Willie claimed he had been in bed at the time of the murders because he had to be at work at 5 a.m., and this was corroborated by others who knew him. Willie knew that if he left the house during that time frame, his own security cameras would show that, and police were ultimately satisfied that he was home the entire night. The State Law Enforcement Division, which is known as SLED, oversaw the autopsies and the collection of evidence from the victims' bodies. Forensic pathologist Dr. Cynthia Shandell conducted 2 of the autopsies, while Dr. Susan Presell performed the other. Both Diane and Jatavius had each been killed by a single close-range gunshot to the head. Diane was shot in the back right-hand side of her head, with the bullet exiting her left cheek. Jatavius had a laceration due to blunt force injury on the right side of his scalp and a skull fracture underneath. He also had several scrapes on his body. He suffered a close-range gunshot wound through his left cheek just below his eye, which traveled into his head through his brainstem. The bullet was recovered in 3 fragments from the back right side of Jatavius's head. Diane had been shot at least 4 times at close range in the face, below her right eye, and in the right side of her neck, and part of the bullet had shot her in the face and exited the side of her neck next to her jaw. The fatal shot was likely the one to the neck, which immediately shattered her brainstem and spinal cord. Another gunshot fractured Diane's upper spine, which, had she survived, would have meant she would have lived with significant physical impairment, and most likely would have not been able to walk again. Deanna had also been shot in the upper right part of her back. The bullet exited above her left collarbone and caused bleeding into her left lung. She sustained another gunshot wound to her right shoulder. She clearly sustained more damage than her mother and her brother. Swabs were taken from Deanna's mouth and the lower private areas of her body, and these revealed the presence of semen on her mouth area and on her pajama pants. They were sent in for testing. However, there was no indication at this time that there had been any penetration of her genital area. As arrangements were being made for Dina, Jatavius, and Deanna to be laid to rest back in their hometown of Gifford, on the evening of July 16th, a vigil was held for them at the Tree of Life Ministries in North Charleston. Among the 175 people that paid their respects and came together to honor the victims were Jatavius's friend Usha Mackey and Diane's former supervisor, Anthony Gillard. On July 18th, just 2 days after what would have been Deanna's 15th birthday, Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna's loved ones had to say their goodbyes to them at their joint funeral. There were so many people anticipated for that service that it was actually held at the elementary school auditorium. To me, it is always heartbreaking to see more than one casket lined up next to one another, just a family gone altogether. This was the moment everything became real for Marquise. He would never see his mother again, and never see his younger brother and sister, whom he'd always fiercely tried to protect. Now they were gone. While Marcus was, of course, beyond thankful that his own children were physically unharmed, there was no denying that things would change forever. Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna were all buried at the Mount Zion Cemetery back in G-Ford. But Marcus was still scared. If someone could shoot 3 members of his family at close range, and apparently force themselves upon his teenage sister, a family who hadn't done anything bad to anyone, then what was stopping them from jumping in their car and heading to Florida to do the same thing to Marquise and his family? No one knew why they were targeted to begin with, but at this stage, law enforcement felt that the victims knew their assailant, but were staying tight-lipped about the investigation. Tia Thomas, whose daughters were good friends with Deanna, told one newspaper that, from what she observed, Jatavius was a pleasant young man, but he had supposedly been running around with a rougher crowd lately. Investigators wondered if the killer could have known the family this way, but still, there didn't seem to be a motive. Nothing seemed to be stolen from the apartment, and it seemed Deanna was chased down and then, of course, forced into a sex act, so they needed to dig deeper. As authorities looked back to see if there had been any previous police involvement, they noted that, a month before the murders, a neighbor had reported that Diane's grandchildren had actually been left alone in the apartment. Jatavius was supposed to be the one babysitting the kids, which would make sense because Diane was at work. However, somehow the younger children had accidentally been locked inside a bedroom in the apartment. Both of the kids were totally unharmed, and a maintenance man had to come and unlock the door. Apparently, the Department of Social Services had to be notified, but there was never anything to follow up on. Still, this incident didn't seem to be related to the murders in any way, and it didn't indicate who the killer would be. The following evening, at a community meeting providing an update on this investigation, Dexter County Sheriff Ray Nash told a gathering of about 40 concerned residents that, at this stage, law enforcement had no reason to believe that this was just a random crime, but they still didn't know what the motive was for the murders. Of course, this did nothing to calm this community. They knew a killer was still on the loose. Among those in attendance were residents of Building 105, where Diane's body had been found 4 hours after the shooting. They were unhappy that it had taken so long for her body to be found, largely due to the way she had been laid out in the open, exposed all of that time. Nor could they understand why it had taken so long for deputies to find Diane. Given that the 911 calls came from residents in Building 105 itself, because one caller said she heard gunshots right in the back of her apartment in Building 105. Sheriff Nash explained that, until additional units arrived on the scene, the sheriff's office only had 3 or 4 deputies to patrol this entire bigger area of the apartment complex. At this point, evidence was still being collected and processed. The shoes that had left the impressions on the floor were identified by SLED agent Vicky Hinton as Nike Air Force One sneakers. Detective Aisel had been right. Meanwhile, the .640 caliber shell casings had undergone thorough ballistics analysis and testing by SLED. There's something that I want to explain quickly here and give you some background. In very basic terms, when a firearm is discharged, the firing pin inside leaves a unique mark on the back of the bullet shell casing. This means you can not only trace a shell casing to a particular make of a gun, but also to a specific weapon. Again, this is sort of like fingerprinting but for guns, and no 2 guns will leave the same mark on the shell casing. They always have their own very minuscule internal imperfections, so it would be impossible for the killer or killers to blame it on any other weapon. For all intents and purposes, all 3 shots look to have come from an identical gun. As the testing was being conducted on the markings on the shell casings of this triple murder, SLED agent Tracy Thrower found that not only had these all been fired from the same weapon, but the markings also matched shell casings from 2 separate shootings, 2 other shootings. They were able to figure this out thanks to what's known as the Integrated Ballistics Identification System, which is sort of like CODIS. You know how we look for DNA that's related to other crimes? This system matches shell casings with the same type of markings. The system acts like a screening tool that compares the images to other similar images to find similarities between unconnected cases, or I should say, previously unconnected cases. This means that those might end up being related to this triple murder. In Agent Thrower's opinion, the likelihood that another firearm could have produced the type of markings on these shell casings in the 3 shootings was so rare, it would be practically impossible. This was the first big break in this case. One of the other shootings where the same weapon seemed to have been used was committed at the Anchor Bar and Grill in North on March 4th, just over 4 months before the DeVore murders. In this previous case, .640 caliber Smith & Wesson casings were found in a parking lot. The other crime with related casings occurred as a drive-by on March 20th at another apartment complex called Hunter Ridge Apartments on Hunter Ridge Lane in Chester County. This is off Ashley Phosphate Road, and around 24 shell casings were found on the road following the shooting. Nobody was killed or injured in either of these other shootings, but they did remain unsolved. Still, investigators knew if they could find the person or persons involved in either of those previous shootings, where at least there could be witnesses, this could potentially lead them to whoever killed Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna. Not only had no arrest been made in the Anchor Bar shooting, but there were no suspects, so SLED contacted North Charleston PD for their reports on those incidents. On July 19th, detectives spoke to a bouncer who had been working at the Anchor Bar that night, and his name was Regal Chavers. According to Regal, in the early morning hours of March 4th, a man had been kicked out of the bar, which was only 12 miles from the Archdale Forest complex, where the DeVore family was eventually killed. Regal said he saw the patron walk across the parking lot and get into a black pickup truck. The vehicle's front and back passenger windows were rolled down. As the pickup pulled away, the man inside picked up a semi-automatic handgun and fired a single shot from the back seat. Someone else sitting in the driver's seat then fired multiple shots using what seemed like a Tech-9 submachine gun. Regal described the man in the back seat as being a shorter black male, around 5 feet 4 inches to 5 feet 5 inches tall, about 25 years old, with closely cropped hair. Police had already arrested someone for the shooting at the Hunter Ridge apartment, which was even closer to where Diane's apartment was, less than 4 miles away. His name was Xavier Walker, and he was currently out on bond. Several eyewitnesses who knew Xavier had identified him as one of the 2 shooters at the Hunter Ridge scene, and he was charged. But when investigators went to speak to Xavier about Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna's murders, he denied knowing anything about the slayings. He also denied being the shooter at Hunter Ridge or the Anchor Bar. However, he said that he did have the name of the person who was with him on both of those occasions, but Xavier would only give law enforcement the information if he could have his own charges dropped. Once they struck a deal with him, he said that on the night of March 4th, he'd been at the bar with his friend, 25-year-old Anthony Sanders, when Anthony was kicked out of the bar around 4:30 in the morning. The men got into the pickup truck that Anthony had borrowed from a friend. Anthony was in the driver's seat with Xavier beside him. As they drove through the parking lot, Anthony shot at the bar outside the window using a semi-automatic handgun. But didn't the eyewitness say that one guy was in the back seat shooting and one was up front? It seems the story is a little bit off, but they let him continue because it's all they had. Xavier then claimed that on March 20th, he'd been in a fight with someone who lived at the Hunter Ridge apartment complex. He said later that day, the same guy that he was with the night at the bar, Anthony Sanders, had picked him up in a vehicle, and they drove back to Hunter Ridge together. There was a shootout, and Xavier claimed Anthony had fired several shots at someone who shot at them first. Of course, that would be the story. Xavier stated that Anthony had used the same weapon on both occasions. It was encouraging that detectives now had another person of interest, but they had no way of knowing whether Anthony was really involved and, if so, to what extent. Was Xavier the killer, and was he just trying to make his friend the scapegoat? They didn't know. But as investigators looked further into Anthony, they learned he was unemployed and no stranger to breaking the law. He already had a criminal record for a variety of offenses. In August 2002, Anthony was charged with possession with the intent to distribute drugs and possession with the intent to distribute drugs in the proximity of a school. In January the following year, he was charged with 3 counts of simple assault, but was only convicted of 1 of those. Later that year, he was charged with a DUI and driving while his license was suspended. In May of 2004, he was charged with driving with a suspended license and possession of drugs. Anthony was born on July 1, 1982, and he grew up in the Charleston area. He never knew his father, but he had a sister and several brothers, including an identical twin named Tony. Based on Anthony's criminal record, Dorchester County decided that in order to get more information about whether or not he was involved in the DeVore family murders, they were going to initiate a surveillance operation to see whether Anthony would incriminate himself or possibly lead police to the murder weapon. While monitoring him, Anthony was arrested during a traffic stop on July 24th, and they were able to take him in for illegally discharging a firearm in the Hunter Ridge shooting. Following his arrest, Anthony wouldn't say anything to detectives Garrison and Michael Giglio, which of course was his right, and he asked to speak to an attorney before saying anything further. The detectives had been careful not to mention anything to Anthony about the murders at this stage. As far as Anthony knew, they were only interested in the unsolved shootings from March, and they wanted to see what he would say. Someone who did talk to the investigators, though, was Anthony's girlfriend, Media Thompson. She had been driving the car when Anthony was arrested during that traffic stop. Media told officers the couple had been dating for about 3.5 years. While they didn't live together, Anthony often visited Media at her place. And guess where that was? In apartment 105D at the Archdale Forest apartment complex, the same exact complex where Deanna, Diane, and Jatavius lived and were found murdered. Is this a coincidence or something more? When asked if she knew anything that happened related to the triple murder, Media said that on the night of the murders, Anthony came over to visit her, but he didn't stay the whole evening. He left her place around 10 p.m., and police realized that upon Media giving them her address, this wasn't just the same building where Deanna's body had been found, because Xavier didn't match the description that Reginald had previously given. He had dreadlocks, not closely cropped short hair. At this same time, Detective Tim Morgan was analyzing Anthony and Xavier's cell phone records from July 6th through the 12th. Xavier's phone was turned off from 10:30 p.m. on July 9th, the night before the shootings, until 8:46 am on July 10th. So, all through the night, Xavier's phone was not on, but Anthony's phone records showed multiple brief calls during the early morning hours of July 10th, with not much of a gap in between. He made a call at 2:05 a.m., then someone called him a minute later. The next outgoing call from Anthony's cell was at 2:24 a.m. to his girlfriend Media. You might recall that I mentioned that 2:24 a.m., the time that the first 911 call came in after the shootings at 2:25 a.m. Anthony called a female friend of his, Shayla, who lived in a nearby Goose Creek apartment building. They spoke for about 18 minutes. Anthony made another call at 3:24 a.m. to a teenage girl that he knew, who we're going to call Sasha. She lived out in Roro, Virginia, but she had lived in North Charleston back in 2006, a year before the murders. At that time, she had only been 14 years old, and she was in a relationship with Anthony back then, who was 10 years older than her. That's interesting considering Deanna was also 14. Anthony had been charged with kidnapping and criminal sexual conduct with a minor in June of 2006 over his involvement with Sasha, but the charges were eventually dismissed. This, of course, piqued the detective's interest. When Detective Garrison went to Virginia to interview Sasha, she said she was actually surprised to get a call from Anthony in the middle of the night. He didn't sound like himself, and during the conversation he kept repeating that he needed to get out of South Carolina, calling himself AUP, his words. Sasha said this was very unlike the man that she knew. Anthony also told Sasha that he'd been kicked out of the Anchor Bar before a shooting had occurred. There were no phone numbers connected to the victims in the DeVore family in either Anthony's or Xavier's phone records. The closest cell tower to the apartment complex was a tower called number 6040, located on Trade Street. This was directly behind Festival Center Mall, which was less than a mile from Diane's apartment building. Detective Morgan could see that calls from Anthony's cell from 1:38 a.m. to 2:26 a.m. and pinged off of Tower 6040. As more phone calls were made from his cell phone between 2:26 a.m. and 2:35 a.m., the phone pinged off of a tower called 6139, which is located on Yolanda Drive. Then at 2:36 a.m., his phone pinged off both towers, 6139 and 6024, at Ashley River Road. These latter towers were ones en route from the apartment complex to the area where Anthony's mom lived in the Forest Hills neighborhood. Based on the cell and ballistics evidence, in conjunction with Xavier naming Anthony as a possible suspect, a search warrant was executed on Anthony's apartment. He lived on Popperdam Creek Drive in North Charleston. All detectives knew for sure so far was that he was linked to the murder weapon and the general area of Archdale Forest at the time of the murders, and not whether he was the one who actually pulled the trigger in the slayings. You'll remember I said that the gel lifts from the shoe impressions at the scene were Nike Air Force Ones. Investigators recovered 3 pairs of Nike Air Force One sneakers from Anthony's bedroom, which he shared with his twin brother, Tony. Is it weird? Because I thought it was odd that the twins were named Anthony and Tony because it's basically the same name. It's just a thought that crossed my mind. The men slept in single beds, one on each side of the room, and in between there were stacks of about 10 shoeboxes lined up against the wall. The sneakers ranged in sizes from 9 to 11. But also, inside this bedroom, law enforcement found a black Converse shoebox containing ammunition for a .32 caliber Derringer, as well as 3 Federal brand .40 caliber Smith & Wesson bullets, the same caliber and make as the shell casings from the Anchor Bar and the Hunter Ridge shootings and the triple homicide. Kind of interesting. Then under Anthony's bed was that .32 caliber Derringer itself and a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson shell casing manufactured by a company called RP. Investigators also found a safe next to Anthony's bed, and inside were the usual things you would expect to find: photographs, letters, but there was also an arrest warrant and a newspaper clipping from July 12th, which included the story about the brutal DeVore family triple murder. Okay, that's super suspicious. There were also letters from Sasha, but there was no sign of an actual murder weapon. Detective Garrison then interviewed Anthony's twin brother, Tony, about Anthony's whereabouts on the night of the triple murder. Tony stated that Anthony had stayed with his girlfriend, Media. He came home briefly around 11 p.m., but he said he later left to go back over to Media's apartment. Tony knew Anthony hadn't come home because Tony had been awake all night and he hadn't seen his brother. When police quizzed Anthony about where the .40 caliber handgun was, he denied ever owning any firearms. That's when Detective Garrison hit Anthony with the news that if he didn't tell them where the weapon was, he would be charged with 3 counts of murder. They knew he was lying because they found ammunition and a firearm at his house. Again, Anthony shut down. He refused to answer any of their questions without speaking to his attorney. We actually don't see this that often, and I would expect this because it's a right to remain silent, but many people don't use that right. By now, the DNA samples from Deanna's clothing and her body had been run through CODIS, the National DNA Database, to see if there were any matches to any known offenders, and there weren't. However, DNA from samples taken from Deanna's pajama pants revealed a mixed profile from 2 individuals, and investigators hoped that they would soon be able to get a DNA sample from Anthony. What was so atypical about this whole investigation was that instead of a particular suspect being identified first and then cross-checking the forensic evidence, it was the forensic evidence of the gun casings themselves that had led them to Anthony. It was a little bit backwards. On August 2nd, Anthony was charged with the murders of Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna, but the murder weapon was still missing, and answers as to how Anthony even knew his victims and what his motive was remained unclear. In terms of an alibi, a police affidavit stated that Anthony claimed he was at home on the evening in question, though he later stated he hadn't said this at all. But when Anthony was being escorted to court for his bond hearing, he asked Detective Garrison out of the blue if he'd like to have the gun that was involved in the killings. Detective Garrison obviously said yes, to which Anthony cryptically replied, "One day, I'll tell you what happened." Anthony's bond was denied, and he then remained in custody. Diane's surviving son, Marquise, was incredibly relieved to hear that someone had been charged and was off the streets, but now a different sort of waiting game began until Anthony would have his day in court. It was too early to tell whether a conviction was likely, and the investigation was still ongoing. The day after Anthony was charged, on August 3rd, Detective Garrison interviewed a man named Richard Alexander. Richard had come in to report that his Smith & Wesson semi-automatic .40 caliber handgun and some loose rounds in an ammunition can had been stolen. He told Detective Garrison that in January of 2007, prior to the March shootings, he'd purchased these items, which he kept in the seat of his black Chevy pickup truck. Richard had first noticed his gun and ammo were gone from his pickup in the days following the murders, and he had what he described as a bad feeling, but he didn't report them stolen until now. He had no idea how long these items had actually been gone, but it was definitely before the murders. Richard told Detective Garrison that a friend of his, who happened to be named Anthony Sanders, who Richard knew had been charged with the crime, borrowed his pickup truck all the time. Anthony, it turns out, was actually Richard's drug dealer, and they had an agreement that if Anthony wanted, sometimes he could give Richard drugs, and in return, Richard would allow him to do things, like bring women to his apartment, where he could have sex with them in one of his bedrooms, or borrow his truck in exchange for drugs. Now, officers didn't seize a can of ammunition in the original search of Anthony's apartment, and they couldn't even recall seeing one. But when they looked back at photographs that they took in Anthony's bedroom, they saw a can matching the description of the one that Richard said had been stolen. So a second search warrant was executed, and they seized this can. Now Richard couldn't say it was the exact same one that he was missing, but it definitely looked like it. Richard also told Detective Garrison that following the triple murder, Anthony had actually asked him if he knew anything about DNA. Richard told Anthony that police can get DNA from saliva, blood, or semen, to which Anthony then asked him whether it would matter if a condom had been used. Then the conversation ended, and Richard was left wondering whether Anthony might have committed some kind of sex offense. If that's not telling, I don't know what is. Meanwhile, detectives went back to the Archdale Forest apartments with a picture of Anthony to see if any of Deanna's neighbors would recognize him. Not only did some of the neighbors recognize Anthony, but they told officers that they'd seen him prior to the murders talking to Deanna while she was hanging out with her friends in the area. It seems like this is all starting to come together. On August 30th, Anthony was indicted by a Dorchester County grand jury for 3 counts of murder. The charges against his friend Xavier over the Hunter Ridge shooting were dropped in exchange for Xavier's cooperation. Of course, Anthony pleaded not guilty, and he was actually facing the death penalty if he got convicted. From what investigators could tell from his upbringing, Anthony did come from a really tough background, and while he had family around him, including his mother, Patty, and his sister, his older brothers were said to be a bad influence. Anthony had been close to his mother, but she sadly passed away suddenly the year before from complications following childbirth. But despite these struggles, Anthony was said to be doing the best he could on his own with his young son, and it seemed like he truly wanted to maintain a healthy relationship with him and be a present father. It was his mother's passing that made Anthony realize he needed to step it up and be an active part of his son's life. But it wasn't long before Anthony began abusing drugs and alcohol. In addition to drinking heavily, Anthony was involved in experimenting with psychotropic drugs, including ecstasy and dealing crack. In the meantime, Anthony's DNA had been collected, and it had been tested against what was found on Deanna's body, her pajama pants, as well as the front doorknob of the apartment. SLED agent Katie Coy identified a partial DNA profile obtained from the semen of Deanna's oral swabs that matched Anthony. The match was around 1 in 260, meaning there was only a 1 in 260 chance that the DNA belonged to Anthony. So this wasn't as encouraging as investigators might have hoped for, because in many criminal cases, DNA results are usually much more significant. At the time, SLED didn't conduct DNA testing for male profiles using this test called a YST test, which identifies the Y chromosome. So the sample was sent to be run by another lab, a private lab. However, he was excluded as a contributor for the semen that was detected on Deanna's pajama pants, as well as the DNA found on the apartment doorknob. That makes things confusing, but I think it's safe to say that he had an encounter with Deanna, and it doesn't appear to have been consensual. Then she ended up dead from a weapon he was in possession of. On July 16, 2008, First Circuit Solicitor David Pascoe announced that the state would be pursuing the death penalty. By now, the solicitor's office had established aggravating circumstances that justified the sentence in Anthony's case. He killed more than one person and had committed these murders in conjunction with a burglary and criminal sexual conduct. The latter offense was well established by the presence of Anthony's DNA on the oral swabs. The public still didn't know what happened to Deanna, beyond David Pascoe just saying that it was absolutely horrendous. Still, there was no mention of a motive. The announcement about the death penalty gave Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna's loved ones a pause. A cousin of the family, Chantel Miller, who had always been opposed to the death penalty, now said it hit so close to home and was so personal that she's had a lot to process. She said if he's found guilty, she wouldn't be against the death penalty. Yes, people do change their minds when something happens to them or someone they love. It makes you look at things differently. By now, the first anniversary of the murders had come and gone. Chantel and another cousin, Nan Ballard, visited the graves of Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna to plant a rose bush and tie 3 balloons to Deanna's grave in honor of her 16th birthday, which she would have celebrated that month. Pre-trial hearings didn't even get underway until over a year later, in November 2009. The prosecution now offered to forego the death penalty in exchange for a plea, which would carry the reduced sentence of life in prison without parole. Anthony initially seemed to think this was going to be something he was going to go along with, but at the last minute, the man changed his mind. At a subsequent hearing, a status conference had significant implications on how Anthony's trial would unfold. The state was now offering not to pursue the death penalty in exchange for Anthony waiving his rights to a jury trial. If a judge found Anthony guilty, he was instead looking at 30 years to life in prison for each indictment. Sometimes I do get mad when these kinds of deals are offered, but this course of action was initiated in consultation with Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna's family. They knew that even if Anthony were found guilty, the appeal process would be so long, and it just wasn't something that they thought they could handle. It could go on for decades. So fair enough. Even though this might sound like a get-out-of-jail-free card in terms of avoiding the death penalty, a bench trial isn't without risks. Instead of a jury, an accused person may encounter a judge who is known for a high rate of convictions or harsh sentences. Unlike when you have a jury trial, the judge is privy to every single piece of evidence. You know how sometimes in cases we get frustrated because certain things are held back from the jury, and we're like, I wish they would have known that? Well, the judge would. As far as Anthony's attorneys were concerned, they felt a bench trial was in his best interest. A lot of times it's really hard to find potential jurors who are opposed to the death penalty. Anthony's attorneys also thought a bench trial would be better for their client, given the weakness, in their opinion, of the DNA evidence. They felt like a judge would be able to assess this aspect of the case better than a jury would. So Anthony's attorneys signed what they call a waiver, and Anthony was questioned by the judge during a very lengthy hearing. He was asked things like whether he understood this waiver. He said he did, he was willing to sign it, to avoid the death penalty, so it was approved. Now, 28-year-old Anthony's trial got underway on March 8, 2010, so many years later, at the Dorchester County Courthouse in St. George. He stood before Circuit Judge R. Markley Dennis Jr. The prosecution's case was presented, and it was that in the early morning hours of July 9, 2007, Anthony, who was armed with a handgun, gained access to the DeVore family's apartment with the sole intent of forcing Dina to engage in a sex act. They believe she was forced to take off her pajama bottoms and her underwear at gunpoint and proceeded to give him oral sex. But at some point, before intercourse could begin, Diane and Jatavius either arrived home or were already in the apartment and were awoken. Anthony was most likely caught off guard, and to eliminate any threat to him, he shot Jatavius in the face. Then, as Diane ran for the door, Anthony shot her in the back of the head. It is just disgusting to think about Deanna having just witnessed her mother and her brother being murdered. She ran from the apartment barefoot, clutching her pajama pants and her underwear, and as she fled, Anthony chased her down. It just so happened he caught up to her right in the back of his own girlfriend's apartment, where he then shot the teen dead. After Deanna fell to the ground, Anthony shot her 3 more times before fleeing the area, calling his girlfriend Media as he drove away. I cannot even begin to imagine how absolutely terrifying this must have been for Deanna. Not only had she just been violated, but she witnessed the murder of her mother and brother. She was desperately trying to get away. The sheer terror that she must have experienced is unimaginable, and it's unthinkable to me that a man would kill a young girl over pleasure. But it's so common, as most of you know. It's just disgusting. And it doesn't even matter that Anthony had a girlfriend that he could have easily had sexual relations with. That's not the point. They want what they can't have. They enjoy the chase and forcing women into these unspeakable things, all in the name of control and getting off. It's beyond me how their brains work. The state was open about the fact that there were no eyewitnesses or any solid evidence that Anthony had previously known Diane, Jatavius, or Deanna. The prosecution's case against Anthony was purely circumstantial, but this wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Circumstantial evidence can be both powerful and compelling. The evidence in its totality was what pointed to Anthony's guilt. One of the most incriminating pieces of evidence was the 15-minute period when no calls were made or received on his cell phone just before the murders, with the prosecutor saying that it cannot be explained away as a coincidence that there's no phone activity while all these other actions are going on. Anthony's sneakers were the same size and type as the shoe impressions, and the bullets found in his home matched in caliber and brand with the shell casings found at the scene. But the most condemning piece of evidence of all was what was in Anthony's safe. If he wasn't guilty, there was no explanation for him to have saved a newspaper article about the triple homicide. It was a memento. The other items in the safe, such as photographs and letters, were also little mementos of his previous crimes. Anthony also had ample opportunity to steal the gun from his friend Richard, whose pickup truck he regularly borrowed, and the shell casing in his bedroom matched the ones found at the Anchor Bar shooting with which Anthony had been connected. One of the pieces of evidence on the side of the defense, though, was that none of Anthony's sneakers could be definitively matched to the shoe impression found at the scene. While the sneakers were the same size and type as the ones that left the impressions, SLED agent Vicky Hinton found the gel lifts were consistent with all Nike Air Force One sneakers of that type and size. Basically, what she testified was that Air Force Ones or sneakers with similar tread design accounted for about 95% of her cases. It was a very popular shoe type, so the defense said it wasn't conclusive as to whether Anthony's shoes were the ones that left those impressions. The defense also said that the fact that the DNA from Deanna's oral swabs wasn't a high statistical match was another aspect of reasonable doubt. The fact that investigators didn't appear to pursue Xavier as aggressively as they did Anthony was also raised, but Xavier had been subsequently charged and denied bond in another murder that occurred after Anthony was arrested. That being said, the defense claimed that this was inadequate investigation and Anthony chose not to testify in his defense. On March 9th, Judge Dennis found Anthony guilty of all 3 counts of murder. Before he was sentenced, Diane's cousin, Carolina Anderson, addressed the court. She gave a moving statement as to the anguish and pain the murders left in their wake, saying, "I'd like to speak on behalf of the Grant family and the DeVore family. This was a family that never bothered anyone. I knew Diane, we worked together for the past 9.5 years of her life, and I really got to know her. She made sure she got the job done. Regardless, the boss could tell her things, and there was nothing that she would say. She would walk away, she wouldn't harm a fly. She was always a sweet, kind, loving person, very quiet. She loved to laugh, and she loved to eat and have a good time with her family. Deanna helped me with being able to read and go on with school. Deanna was a sweetheart. I don't understand why these things happen, and I know that God's will has to be done. I assume that this was God's way of saying, come on home, but the way that it was done, we may never know what or why. All we can do is ask that you bring justice. I didn't just lose a first cousin and a co-worker, I lost a good friend. This is a tight-knit family. Diane was so happy-go-lucky. For the first time in her life, she was going to meet her brother, whom she had never seen before. I thank God he spared his children. The Marquise wasn't around. No matter what you say here today, it won't bring them back. But if some justice can be served on behalf of this, our family can get closure. We will really appreciate it, and you do what you have to do, but we appreciate what you do, and ask for justice for our family." The prosecutor asked for Anthony to be sentenced to nothing less than the maximum of 30 years to life in prison without parole, emphasizing that Jatavius and Diane had both been shot at close range, in the face and then in the back of the head. Judge Dennis sentenced Anthony to life without parole on all 3 counts. The tipping point requiring the maximum sentence, according to the judge, was Anthony chasing Deanna down. She had been hunted down like an animal. After she fled the apartment, she ran into the night, desperately hoping someone would come to her rescue. But before they could, she was murdered and left out in the open for hours without dignity. Anthony had nothing to say during the sentencing. As far as the prosecution, the defense, and the victims' families were concerned, there were still no definite answers as to how Anthony knew this family or what his motive was. But I think we can kind of put 2 and 2 together based on the available evidence. The prosecution and the investigators believe that Anthony, seeing Deanna around the complex when he was there visiting his girlfriend, Media, had run into Deanna and possibly even struck up a conversation in the weeks leading up to her death. She was very outgoing. We know that much. But Anthony had bad intentions. He decided he wanted her and nothing was going to stop him. The more he saw her around, the stronger his urge grew, and finally, the night he was over at Media's, the urge was just too strong. In the early morning hours of July 10th, Anthony knocked on the front door of Diane's apartment. At that point, Diane and Jatavius weren't home, and maybe he knew this by having walked the apartment in the weeks leading up to the murders. But Deanna was home. She was babysitting her niece and nephew, who were already safely tucked into their beds. So Deanna opened that front door, and Anthony threatened her at gunpoint. He forced his way inside and subjected a terrified Deanna to a forced sexual act upstairs. Then her mother and brother arrived home. Anthony went back downstairs and first shot and killed Jatavius and then Diane. We know Deanna then fled downstairs, half naked at the front door, holding her pajama pants and underwear before Anthony chased her down and shot her behind Building 105. We know that Deanna not only tried to escape, but in leaving the house, she led Anthony outside, away from her niece and nephew, who were peacefully sleeping upstairs. In doing so, she saved their lives. We don't know what this man would have done. Anthony did attempt to appeal based on grounds of ineffective counsel, but this was dismissed almost 8 months later. On January 6, 2011, Anthony filed for an application for post-conviction relief. This was also dismissed, but this did not deter Anthony. He applied to the Supreme Court of South Carolina in June of 2015, and the court granted him an evidentiary hearing in October of 2018, which wasn't that long ago. The court found that Anthony did in fact receive ineffective assistance of counsel. At this point, he said he would have never signed that waiver. He only signed it because his attorneys told him it wasn't enforceable. I don't know why they would tell him that, but this is what he claimed. Now, due to the impact of the pandemic at the time, it resulted in so many backlogs in the court system that this evidentiary hearing wasn't held until 2 years later, in 2021. It was then more than another 2 years before the First Judicial Circuit Court granted Anthony a belated direct appeal, despite finding that Anthony knowingly and involuntarily waived his right to a jury trial. However, his request for a new trial was denied. In March of this year, 2024, Anthony appealed his conviction. He claimed the evidence merely raised a suspicion that he was involved in the murders and not that he committed them, and therefore this is grounds for an acquittal and a new trial. At the time of recording this, the South Carolina Court of Appeals has yet to issue a ruling. And of course, this gives me chills in a bad way. 41-year-old Anthony continues to reside at the Lee Correctional Institute in South Carolina, and I cannot imagine the ongoing pain, uncertainty, and anguish that this is causing all of this family's loved ones. Instead of being able to move through their overwhelming grief and process the loss day to day, they're now facing not just the possibility that Anthony may be acquitted and even ordered a new trial, but if he's again found guilty, he may receive the death penalty, a sentence that the DeVore and Grant families never wanted to begin with. This will trigger years and years of further appeals. But this is our legal system, and I do respect it nonetheless. Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna's families understandably remain shattered to this day over the loss of 3 people whom they loved very deeply. Deanna's heroism in making that split-second decision to flee the apartment after being violated in the most intimate way possible saved the lives of her niece and nephew. This is a testament to the kind of selfless person she was and how far she would go to protect her family, values which were instilled in her by her mother and her older brothers. Marquise and his wife Sonia know that Diane, Jatavius, and Deanna live on, and how Diane's grandchildren are being raised in a way that honors the closeness, warmth, and unconditional love that Marquise will never forget as being the heart and soul of his mother's home.